So you should now be able to see the agenda for today's webinar. Again, my name is Chase Gunnell. I'm with the Department of Fish and Wildlife Public Affairs Department. We're going to start off with Ron Coleman on our team, who's going to give a structural landscape update on European green crabs. We'll also have Larissa from the Shoalwater Bay Indian tribe to talk about green crabs in Willapa Bay. Sean McDonald and Emily Grason from UW and Washington Sea Grant will provide a bit of status update on green crabs and their ecology, as well as infestations in other states. And after a quick break, we'll have Alan from WDFW provide an overview of management actions, funding requests, and some of the strategies and tactics that we're looking at going into the year ahead. I'll conclude with a short discussion and update around communications, outreach, and public reporting for green crabs. Then we'll have that panel discussion at the end. And before we get rolling, many of you may be familiar, but for those who are not, European green crabs are a globally damaging invasive species. They're considered one of the most damaging invasive species everywhere they're present outside their native range in the world. And we've seen significant increases in green crab populations on the Washington coast, as well as several areas of the Salish Sea, including Lummi Bay, particularly in 2021. Again, if you have questions, please put them into the chat. And if we don't get to your questions or we're not able to get to them during the panel discussion at the end, please feel free to follow up with Chelsea or myself via email and we'll get back to you. Again, this is a stakeholder briefing intended to support information sharing, coordination, and other collaboration around European green crabs in the year ahead. Department of Fish and Wildlife has held similar briefings and discussions with tribal co-managers, with our fellow state agencies, as well as with federal partners in recent weeks. And if you feel like you would appreciate additional meeting or briefing for your group, please feel free to follow up with Chelsea and we'll be able to work with you on that. I think that just about covers it for the introduction. I'm now going to turn it over to Ron Coleman, who's going to provide the structural landscape update on European green crabs.
Thank you, Chase. Everyone can see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, thank you. All right. All right, so good afternoon, and thank you for joining our European green crab stakeholder presentation for the Outer Coast. Like Chase said, I'm Ron Coleman. I'm the DFW lead for coastal field operations, and I will be talking today on the state management structure supporting this issue. So what are we talking about today? You all know the answer. It's the infamous European green crab who's been in the news a bit lately. In the state of Washington, the green crab is considered a prohibited level 1 species. In this classification, species in this classification pose a high invasive risk, and as such, they're a priority for preventative and rapid response management actions. Because of these characteristics and due to its classification, it is illegal to possess green crabs in Washington. In order to protect native species from misidentification, we are asking the public to report all suspected sightings through our invasive species app or by emailing us directly, we ask, with photos. Among other things, we are currently focused on raising public awareness and education on correctly identifying invasive green crab species in various life stages. We'll talk more about aquatic invasive species permits later, but as a start, we ask that you get in contact with our team as the first step in your green crab response. So with that, I want to zoom out and give everyone a broader perspective on our goals in managing green crab and who does what. So our goals are to, 1, prevent introduction of new green crab populations, 2, control the spread and impact of existing populations, and 3, eradicate locally established populations wherever possible. We do this to protect our native ecosystems, as well as our environmental, economic, and human resources. And since these are pretty broad goals, we break it down into like 6 main objectives that I'll go over. The first one, collaboration. So you're going to hear me say this a few more times, but green crab know no boundaries, and we must collaboratively manage responses. The second, prevention. Prevention is the first line of defense against invasives. And in the long run, it's much cheaper to prevent introduction as opposed to conducting eradication. Early detection. It's easier to manage any invasive at its introduction point. So by identifying regions that green crabs are likely to spread into, we can devote some of our limited resources into early detection efforts. Rapid response. It's important to respond as quickly as possible to an introduction in order to eradicate or reduce the population right from the start. Control. If these measures are insufficient, control efforts must be implemented to keep populations at manageable levels to reduce or eliminate harm to our habitats and our resources. And finally, research. Research is important because it allows us to adapt our management strategies with science-based solutions, ensuring that measures we are taking are tailored to the biology and the behavior of this species. And our partners at Washington Sea Grant will break these down further in a later discussion. In our state, Washington Fish and Wildlife is the lead entity, which means our department is charged with planning, coordinating, and leading the implementation of management actions. Under this umbrella, our Aquatic Invasive Species Program is in turn responsible for, 1, preventing the introduction of aquatic invasive animal species, and 2, controlling or eradicating, if possible, established invasive populations. And just to give you some context, green crab are only part of our unit's focus. As invasive species, they're always on the horizon. Other threats that we tackle or have tackled include zebra quagga mussels, New Zealand mud snails, African clawed frogs, and northern pike, to name a few. So a lot of what we do as the lead agency in controlling invasives is fostering collaborative management, because there's no way we can completely tackle every invasion ourselves. At times, the management of green crab within the state of Washington can seem a bit confusing, especially since our shorelines twist and wind more than 3,000 miles. And these shorelines encompass so many jurisdictions, including local governments, sister state agencies, federal agencies, and tribal governments, not to mention various private landowners and land managers. We must remember, like I said before, that green crab know no boundaries, and management will require collaboration, coordination, and action among all parties involved. So tribal governments and federal agencies are the leads for management in their jurisdiction, and Washington Fish and Wildlife provides assistance and consultation only when requested. On the outer coast, we have worked with the Makah Indian Nation, Quileute Natural Resources, Shoalwater Bay Indian Tribe, and Gunnell Indian Nation to address green crab populations or to conduct early detection monitoring. Larissa from Shoalwater Bay Tribe will later discuss their ongoing efforts to give you some insight into local management actions. We have also worked closely with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Grace Harbor and Willapa to assist with trapping efforts within their federal refuges. These are only a few of our co-managers in the state, and we actively support their control efforts. Washington Fish and Wildlife designated Washington Sea Grant as the lead for the Early Detection Citizen Science Program known as Crab Team. Crab Team was launched in 2015 to fulfill the Washington mandate to monitor green crabs along inland Washington shorelines. In 2020, Crab Team expanded to the outer coast, and they've implemented sentinel sites comparable to those original inland Crab Team sites. The Sea Grant Science Program has 2 main goals: to detect green crab at the earliest possible stage of invasion, and this is to inform managers on trends that are vital to controlling the population and reducing green crab impacts. And their second goal is to build a long-term data set on green crab and other organisms living in soft sediment habitats. This improves the understanding of Washington's pocket estuaries and salt marshes, as well as tracking green crab impacts over time. Early detection efforts and systematically tracking the relative abundance of green crabs is vital for management. It increases our ability to assess, control, reduce the impacts of green crabs. Washington Sea Grant has been a crucial partner to management with their scientific expertise, advice, partner capacity building, as well as coordinating boots in the mud. As green crab numbers increase and their geographical range expands, we have increased the capacity for trapping and monitoring beyond our department and our co-managers to include local independent trapping partners in our fight against the green crab invasion. Our partners include local government agencies, shellfish growers, nonprofit organizations, and really any other entities that have an interest in implementing removal action, as well as having the ability and resources necessary to do so. We want to empower others to work alongside us and collaborate with us, but we need to have policies and management plans in place so we're well positioned to address this issue in a united way. Otherwise, we're just chasing crabs all over the Twin Harbors from one inlet or mudflat to another. This structure allows us to work towards our shared goals of reducing green crab impacts, to share the limited resources we have for trapping gear, and to keep lines of communication open so we're not wasting valuable time and effort. And Alan will speak a little bit more to this later, but Washington Fish and Wildlife has requested funds to directly support local partners. I mentioned that we need a management plan to coordinate effort. Currently, we have one general working structure. It's called the Salish Sea Transboundary Action Plan. This plan was developed in 2019 through funding provided by Puget Sound Partnership. Its purpose is to establish and implement a coordinated and collaborative response to incursions of European green crab within the shared waters of the Salish Sea. Now, there are limits to this structure, but it will be used as a guideline as we discuss development of future management plans. And as noted on this slide, we are aware that we have some gaps in policy, gaps in this plan, and they include some state policy coordination and statewide management. We hope to eventually include a green crab task force, which will tackle specific issues and approaches in both the Salish Sea and on the outer coast. Again, Alan will be speaking more to this later this afternoon. So just to sum up the basic themes from earlier, 1, green crab no boundaries. And 2, we have miles upon miles of shoreline and that they fall within boundaries of private landowners and within jurisdictions of local governments, state, federal, and tribal management. This map breaks out our current landscape down by region, and you can see our main action areas where established populations are being addressed. In the Salish Sea, you see Lummi Bay and Drayton Harbor there in the north, and out here on the outer coast, you see McCall Bay and Grace Harbor and Willapa Bay. The yellow and orange dots indicate a site run by either Sea Grant or one of our partners or co-managers, and those are growing year to year. We recognize that coordinated and collaborative efforts are critical in controlling the species, and we know more partnerships and boots in the mud are needed. Many of you are out there wanting to get involved in the removal of invasive green crab, and we want to enable you to do so. We are working towards building capacity for local management. As great as it would be to just let people go out and get their feet or hands and knees dirty in the mud, we have to put on the brakes and build a framework for building capacity. We want to make sure you have all the tools you need to get started, whether that's appropriate trainings, obtaining the right permits, designing trapping strategies, getting gear and equipment, or even some assistance with boots in the mud. I also want to bring up a reminder of goals from earlier. On the outer coast, our focus is on 1, suppressing locally established populations, and 2, controlling their spread and impact bay-wide. We do this to protect our native ecosystems, as well as our environmental, economic, and human resources. We are committed to the development of a framework that is not only safe for people and non-target species, but also effective in terms of others' valuable time and resources. As a department, we are developing a pathway that allows partners to get started in a way that brings them up to speed with ongoing efforts, allows for collaborative coordinated management strategies, and provides open lines of communication. This slide highlights some of the key components of getting started. As a partner, co-manager, stakeholder, or even private landowner, it's important to have a clear understanding of what your roles and responsibilities are. Are you wanting to volunteer or contribute to Sea Grant's monthly monitoring program? Are you doing independent early detection monitoring? Are you wanting to start trapping efforts for control removal? Or maybe you have land that you'd like someone else to come and assess. Next step would be to reach out to us to get consultation on best practices and development of a trapping strategy that fits your particular location and capacity. This step is really important because coordinating efforts helps to ensure everyone is on the same page and collecting valuable information that can be widely shared. After that, depending on what the location and needs, correct permits and other documentation, such as MOUs, must be obtained. We have an annual green crab AIS permit that I mentioned earlier, and that's required for trapping efforts on any state lands. And we're asking that if an organization is interested in conducting green crab trapping efforts, please contact us directly to start that conversation. As we move forward, we hope to provide others with more rigorous training materials. Trainings will range from species identification, trapping protocols and best practices, to data collection methods and reporting. It is important for everyone to have the knowledge and skills they need before getting out in the mud. And lastly, one of our big requirements for partners is data sharing. Data collection not only allows us to track the invasion, but it helps to inform management on removal efforts and trapping approaches. Green crab control follows an adaptive management-based approach, and we are always learning and improving our management strategies. So real-time data is extremely crucial. So thank you for listening to this hopefully brief overview. In the upcoming presentations, we will take a more detailed dive into current efforts that are being undertaken, local and regional trends, management approaches, and funding, and communication surrounding the green crab invasion.
Thanks so much, Ron. I want to put a plug out there now. If anyone has questions for Ron, feel free to please put them in the chat. And again, if we don't get to your questions after each individual presentation, we'll be sure to get to them during the panel discussion at the end. It looks like we've got about 72 participants right now, and we have a few folks on the phone. And so for folks on the phone, if you'd like to ask a question, if you're unable to get through to us, or if you're having any issues, please feel free to email us at dfwpublicaffairs@dfw.wa.gov. My colleague Diane is standing by monitoring that email. And if you're having any issues on the phone, please feel free to reach out to us that way. Just a couple comments in the chat here, Ron. One saying, thank you for your presentation. Another mentioning, Brian asks, what is the plan to gain permission to access private property? And I assume he's referring to private tidelands here. Do you have any examples of that that's occurred so far? Any thoughts on what the plan might look like going forward?
So typically, if we are accessing private property, we will contact the landowner. Usually we get like tax parcel records. As far as I'm wondering, is he looking at contacting them directly? Or, I mean, I would recommend them go directly through us, and we can like work out getting to private landowners. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we've had a lot of success reaching out to them, building relationships that way. So
thank you. And then is there any, let's see, we're going to talk a little bit more later on during Alan's presentation about what the strategy looks like going forward, requests for additional resources for the Washington coast, including to better leverage local expertise and coordination. We'll talk a bit more about that, both past and future, during the panel and during Alan's discussion. One more question from David here asks about whether we need a MOU or agreement around data collection and getting as much stakeholder participation as possible. What data are we interested in collecting?
So in general, when we are either working with an MOU or like I talked about the AIS permits, we do require like some basic information. Usually that involves locations, lat-long locations, obviously your catch, and then we do like ask some quantifiable amount of bycatch. So those are like the really basic ones. And a lot of times when it gets with an MOU or whatever, we would deal with the requester one-on-one to what, like, you know, based on how much they're trapping or whatever, what would be likely to provide. So, but those are kind of the baseline ones.
We also got a question from Brian about whether traps and bait are available now. And again, I know this is a topic that we'll cover a little bit further down the agenda. I also know that Larissa with Shoalwater and Emily with Washington Sea Grant are both going to talk about some of the different traps and methods that they've used to refine the effectiveness of catching green crabs. But do you want to just briefly touch on whether traps and bait are available now or when that might become more available, given those plans for the future?
Yeah, definitely. As Alan will talk a little bit more about, like we are, as an agency, we are working on acquiring some traps that we will loan out. That being said, traps and bait are like super limited right now, even for us to get with supply shortages and even working with like the bait suppliers in Westport. I can say it has been difficult. So going out and acquiring your own, you'll probably be in the same lines as we are doing that. But yeah, like I said, Alan will talk a little bit more to what we're looking to be able to provide. That should give a little clarity too.
Yeah, and thank you for your questions, Brian. I saw you had 2 additional follow-ups, and both of those topics are going to be covered in some of our upcoming presentations, both around alternate techniques such as scent or pheromones or other strategies that have been employed elsewhere to try to target green crabs, and then also the availability for cost sharing in the future as resources allow to support additional partnerships for green crab trapping. Those are things that we're definitely going to get to later in the agenda today. So please feel free to ask those questions again a bit later if we don't answer them, but I think those questions will be answered in upcoming presentations. Ron, is there anything else you'd like to share? We're a little bit ahead of schedule. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I think a lot of the stuff I sort of touched on, and I know Emily and Sean go into a lot more detail based on some science, some data approach to some of the things I talked about as far as management strategies. And then Alan will add a little more meat into that as to like what the agency and the state overall are looking to do. So hopefully that'll help. If you stay tuned, we'll flesh this out a little bit more.
All right, well, thank you very much, Ron. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Larissa in that case. And again, if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you're having trouble with the webinar or the Q&A, please feel free to drop us an email. And then my colleagues will also be putting in some helpful links and resources into the chat that may provide additional information. Larissa, go ahead and take it away.
Sure. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Larissa Ritzman. Oh, Jesus, close that. I work for the Shoalwater Bay Indian Tribe. I've been working with the Shoalwater Tribe since 2012. In this presentation, I'm discussing what Pacific County Vegetation Management's department and ourselves have done in the Bay since we've been notified of the issue and how we're proceeding and moving forward with it. Of course, it doesn't let me do that. Come on. There we go. So this is just a couple brief photos of what our fieldwork looks like. with Pacific County and ourselves working around the bay. Pacific County obviously has an airboat. We don't have that, so we do utilize that for some certain areas. Most of our other properties are accessed by foot. A little bit of history. In 1998, when they were doing the trapping in Willapa Bay, the tribe did participate. I don't know the extent of the numbers or data that was collected during that. We were not aware when EGC was rediscovered in Willapa in 2015, and only really aware when we were involved in a 2020 February meeting with DFW about European green crab work. Sea Grant is the one who reached out to us later in the summer to coordinate establishing a sentinel site in Tokeland, which we did do. We don't really have any other coordination background other than that little area with ourselves and with Pacific County, because there is no coordinated action plan for Willapa. It's not included in the transboundary plan that it was, I think that was 2018. So our council declared an emergency in January of this year after going over and reviewing the trapping numbers that we had from 2021. And ourselves and the county have committed to a cooperative agreement moving forward. So we started coordinating together in 2020 when trapping first started for us. We only trapped that year, I think just in August and September, maybe a little bit in October around the Tokeland area. Right now, we're still continuing to work together. We share bait, traps, our staff go back and forth, gear. We don't have any external funding sources for this. We've kind of tagged them onto, for the tribe, we've added it kind of as an addendum to what we do for Spartina control. And I believe the county is doing the same sort of situation. So most of the time when the guys are out doing Spartina, they're also doing green crab. PCVM obviously, yeah, shares their airboat services with us if we have to get out in areas that are inaccessible around Tokeland. So from 2021 to now, we haven't acquired any additional funding to ramp up really efforts. We had a grant from our local MRCs for the tribe to buy more shrimp pots. And I believe they provided one to Pacific County for, I think it was just for staff time. So, and we've continued to trap over the winter this year, and we have only just recently seen a slight drop in trapping numbers at one site, but then the crab have actually moved to another site. So we've seen significantly high numbers, at least, and activity in the area. A couple of the concerns locally that we've been hearing from other partners in the area and collaborators is the immense size of the bay is one big issue. I mean, it's 70,000 acres. There have been no real quantifiable assessments to the impacts on aquaculture in the area. The tribe has an aquaculture operation and beds throughout the bay. I know that's one of the main issues for a lot of the growers in the area is that, and also the clam beds. They've seen reductions in clam bed density and a lot of losses. We don't know the impacts that these crab are having to that fishery or even to Dungeness. There's a lot of other work obviously around the bay that's resulted from eelgrass beds and loss of the native beds, and then the japonica that's kind of concentrated itself in areas and decreased a lot of the biomass and shellfish bed functions. So if there's connections between any of those avenues, it really hasn't been assessed, and we don't know how these can be quantified going back a decade or 2 decades when green crab were first discovered in Willapa Bay. For our sites for the tribe in Tokeland, we've kind of delineated them in these, I think there's 7 areas. So West Reservation on the northwest end, the swimming hole is another intertidal area. Trade winds is a intertidal area kind of in front of the hotel. Alder Street is another intertidal area. Around the marina at the end of Tokeland, the Tokeland Hotel, and then around Kidron Island. And that's just for the tribal sites. This is kind of the makeup, what those sites look like. I mean, it's a lot of incised tidal channels. It's pretty much all mud. There's a lot of sand deposition in this area. We have a giant berm that keeps eroding and depositing more sand every time there's a high tide event or a storm. There's not a lot of substrate. It's really high energy. It lacks eelgrass. There's some beds of it. It's the non-native type usually, or it goes back and forth. There's areas of both really, but it's pretty sparse. There's a lot of old Spartina mounds in this area. The only real rocky area that we have is around the marina where there's the jetty rock, and we do find a lot of green crab in that area. For the eastern part of the bay going towards Raymond, these are the kind of areas that we've delineated that have been assessed or not assessed. There's a few of them that we just went through the bay and kind of delineated areas, but we have a lot found presence in a lot of these areas. Not really a high established populations, but there's been documented presence. Mid-Bay, we do know that down by Nakata, there is a pretty substantial population. We've documented presence down by Lynn Point, and there's been some other regions I know people have done trapping on. I'm not entirely sure of like the refuges numbers, but I know they had very few at their Sentinel site. And South Bay areas, this is kind of the areas that we're looking at to do possibly assessments on later this year as we have time, or when they're going out and doing Spartina controls. A lot of the bay sites, this is off of Lynn Point. I mean, it's pretty indicative of what most of the areas look like. A lot of low bank areas, tidal channels, silty clay mud substrate, high velocity. There's a lot of, it's a really, I mean, I think it's the largest tidal prism or second largest tidal prism on the West Coast. So we do a lot of up high shoreline trapping in the, like the fringe area where there's some ponds or something like that. We haven't really explored a lot of deep water because we don't really have traps that will probably actually work in deep water, or we don't really know the effectiveness of them out here. And there are areas, I mean, where it's sandy, where the airboat won't work. And if that substrate is still not able to walk on, we can't access it by foot either. But there are some sites that we've been able to access by airboat, and then some of them probably aren't inaccessible. And then there's other areas that we can't do it by either avenue. For most of our removal trapping, this is what we use. It is the Willapa Marine shrimp pot. It's a 1 inch by 1 inch mesh with 4 entry points, and the bait jar in the middle. And we've caught relatively young of the year, I think 38 millimeters and up in size in these traps. They work very well. They are sort of flimsy. We've already lost a few to getting stuck in the mud. And other things that get bent up pretty fast. They're a local buyer. We can get them through England Marine, and then Willapa Marine is out in Menlo, so we like supporting them. The other one that works pretty well for us that's reasonably priced is the Promar shrimp. It looks pretty much like a Fukui trap. Our Sentinel site protocol obviously only allows Fukui and minnow traps. Our other gear that we need to set up these traps is just the polyline rope, gill net buoys, rebar for weight, and we put tags on them that are just livestock ear tags to ID the traps. We also use a lot of 5-gallon buckets for sorting. We haul everything around with these duck hunting sleds and we also dump and use them for sorting. Because we're setting by land, and throughout the winter, you don't really find the green crab, at least around Tokeland in the shallow water. Pacific County developed this crab rope for us with a hook on the end of it. So it's about 60 to 100 feet of polyline rope with that rebar hook on the end of it. And you throw that out over your line and then pull it back and catch on the buoy and hopefully get the pot in. So that's most of our method for by land trapping through winter. This is an example of how we've kind of recycled materials, because we find a lot of the oyster bags on the shoreline and on the beaches out here. So we try to use those. They are pretty effective in terms of other trap types that we've bought and tried, and they're relatively cheap to create. We just kind of cut holes in them, create the tunnels, set them up like our regular traps and throw them out. Since they are usually a weird shape, we have to stake the actual traps down so they don't roll around and flip over. Bycatch, at least in the Tokeland area, the most often we'll find, yeah, sculpin, shore crab, Dungeness. Occasionally we've had the red rocks and burrowing shrimp and a few hermit crabs, but we don't typically experience very much diversity in the bycatch. It's been these guys most often. If this works, I will try it. This is just a quick video of emptying the trap into a duck boat for sorting. The duck sled, not a boat. Yeah, this is pretty fast. Oops, and that was from January. So this is our shrimp trap or our crab totals since we started trapping in 2020. In 2020, we only did September and October. We just were getting started. We established a Sentinel site, and then we had 2 different times that Sea Grant and DFW were out with us setting traps around the Tokeland area. So we removed 2,081 crab that year. Last year, we upped our efforts, and county was able to remove 3,918 crabs, and we removed 5,965. Our CPUE was extremely high. Since we didn't really set out that many traps, we only started using shrimp pots last October. And I think from October to December, we removed about 4,000 crab just from the Tokeland area. So a lot of our catch was later on in the year. We didn't have shrimp pots before that. So that allowed us to realize that we can do this probably year round. So this year we've been trapping continually. We've removed already about 1,600 crab from the Tokeland area. We have another group that's done about 690, so total 2,309 this year. And the last 2 years, then it's been 14,273. And 2020 and 2022, I mean, that's only been 2 months of work, basically. This is a detail of 2021's trapping. So it looks like, yeah, obviously you can see once we introduced shrimp pots, we had an extremely high catch rate. The next highest one was under our fukuis, it looks like, and even the modified traps caught a lot too for us. 2022, this is what we've done for a breakdown, mostly shrimp pots. Last week when Ron Coleman came out with us, he brought out 3 different kinds of traps to try. So the collapsible crab pots, McKay, a folding fukui, another Ladner, which is I think that was, or McKay was the top down empty one, wasn't it, Ron? I think he knows, and then a 1/2-inch shrimp pot. And those collapsible crab pots did do quite well in the areas where we find pretty high numbers of crab throughout the winter, which is usually around the marina and off of Alder Street. They did do quite well. This is our storage mechanism. So once we catch everything, yeah, we drop it into the freezer. We can only store about 1,000 in our chest freezer before we have to empty it. And our community grant or our community garden takes those crab and composts them. So that we are using them in garden. That other picture is our gravid captures for 2022. I think we're almost up to 30. There's a few more in there from 2021, I think. Says, I was like, oh, that's too many. But that's a pretty good representation. We've had a lot of gravids over the winter that we've brought in from both sites around Tokeland. So 2022's plan, neither the tribe or the county have received any additional funding. So we don't have an option to really ramp up our numbers of trapping. So our focus is going to be removal efforts and assessment efforts kind of combined with Spartina control to kind of get a better understanding of the prevalence throughout the bay. We've quantified some areas to do trapping assessments. We're going to try to work with the shellfish growers and others to be able to get onto a lot more private ground to see what else is out there. Trying to consolidate our data collection, because since we are more into a removal, it's a lot of stuff to go through. When you get 600 crab, nobody wants to count that many crab, or I guess assess the bycatch, really, because it's a lot to do and takes a lot of time, and we really don't have the funding to spend that much time on it either. we're trying to set up some sort of field form that'll just kind of make it quicker when we're out in the field. We use a lot of obviously aerial photos and maps to do these assessments, and we'll just kind of keep tracking that going forward. Yeah, we have established an interlocal agreement with the county. So we're going to try to work on that to increase do a lot more public outreach in the area, and coordinate with a lot of other partners. Obviously partnering with Sea Grant for the Sentinel site, and Alex just lent me a hobo sampler to do some salinity and temperature monitoring in the bay right there. We're just going to be more concentrated on removal efforts and then assessment trapping as we have time. I think a lot of problems in this area is that chemical control is likely not going to be an effective control method in the bay. It's too big of an area, and target species, it's hard to not target, non-target species. There really aren't too many other removal efforts that we can do in this area. It's not like Lummi, which is a contained environment. So there's going to be a lot more complications going forward for that. Yeah, we're just hoping to get out there and get as much done as we can. Work with the county, continue to do that, continue to kind of bridge some connections with other folks in the area to get more removals done and just more assessments done.
Thank you, Larissa. Got just a couple questions in the chat here. And again, we're ahead of schedule, so we'll try to run through these before we, you can leave that screen up if you want. One of the questions, Larissa, was about whether, have you observed the Spartina hummocks being utilized by European green crab? And this is from David. He says, in Oysterville, it is easy to find large burrows in the old hummocks that contain large adult EGC. This habitat seems to be a preferred refuge when other 3D habitat is not nearby. So any observations of Spartina being utilized by EGC?
I mean, the entire bay is full of those old Spartina mounds. So I mean, it's definitely probably one of the main areas that they're using. Around Tokeland, no. In other areas like Hawks Point, down to Smith Creek and Carruthers and down that way, I don't know exactly the specifics of what the sites look like. But I mean, the muddy banks is where we're finding most of the crab that we find up in the intertidal channels. So it is highly likely that, yeah, I mean, that's a preferred habitat and they're probably utilizing it.
Makes sense. Brian, we're going to talk more about emergency funding later in the agenda, so please stay tuned with that question. But Larissa, Brian had another question for you about why do you believe chemical methods wouldn't be effective? I know there's a lot of some sensitivities on that topic, but anything else you can share about your understanding of chemical methods for treating green crab?
I think just in the discussions that we've had with partners, I mean, there really hasn't been a chemical that's developed that can just target green crab. It's going to impact all the other non-target species probably. So I don't know how that could be an effective control method in Willapa Bay.
Is there anything else you'd like to share? Any other topics that come to mind before we move on?
Nope, I think I'm good.
Okay, thank you. We'll try to address some of these other questions in the chat later on in the agenda. I think we're ready to turn it on over to Emily. Emily, take it away.
All right, folks, let me just switch to sharing my screen.
Looks good.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Grason, and I'm a marine ecologist with Washington Sea Grant. I'm also the program lead for Crab Team, which is the program at Sea Grant that is focused on supporting efforts to manage European green crab in the state of Washington. So today, DFW asked us here to provide an update on the recent status of green crab populations, as well as our interpretation of patterns across time and space over the invasion. Larissa just did a phenomenal job of providing a really detailed snapshot of recent trapping efforts in Tokeland and trends in Tokeland. Tokeland is such an interesting site, certainly notable for the dramatic abundances that have been appearing in the last few years. And it's also an interesting site from the historical perspective, where there was some amount of data collected at that location in the early days of green crabs. My talk today is going to zoom out from Tokeland to consider the context of the entire coastal region and even a little bit of the state and the Pacific Northwest as a whole. This is because my goal is to compile observations and evidence from across this region to help us understand green crabs at the landscape scale and across the life cycle of green crabs. So trying to understand these patterns we see in observations, what we see on the ground at individual sites, how do those sites fit together? How do the green crabs change over space and time? And what information do we have to compare them to site to site? Now, since today's meeting is largely focused on coastal shorelines, I'm going to be covering those geographies in more details. As Chase mentioned at the beginning, the inland meeting on Tuesday covered trends and status in the Salish Sea in more detail. So I encourage folks to check out that video if you're interested in learning more about that geography. So as I kick it off today, I want to point out that I'm bringing together information and contributions and data collected from a huge number of partners, some of whom I've been able to fit into a single screen, and a lot of whom are in the room today. So these are folks out there not only conducting trapping work, but also curating and sharing really invaluable information that enables us to understand what's going on in evaluating changing green crab habitat populations over time, why these changes are happening, and what might happen in the future. So I want to thank these folks from the get-go who've shared their data so that we can learn from this. So to start by zooming way out first, the governor's recent declaration of a green crab emergency was based in two alarming trends that the groups here today are well aware of and have been tracking and combating for the last particularly few years. The increase in abundance and the ongoing spread of green crabs into places that they hadn't previously been found. This is really on the coast representing a state change compared to the previous 20 years when green crabs did fail to establish self-sustaining populations. I'll talk a little bit more detail about that later. Now, sites like Tokeland, Larissa provided some really good touchstones that you also might have heard about others in the news that highlight some of the trends that come from these alarming numbers. And they bring attention to these changes very well. My goal here today is to provide some context on those numbers and show you how they fit into the big picture and provide updates on what we've learned and why these things are particularly concerning if anyone needs more convincing. So first, while these trends are truly statewide, we do know so far in the invasion across Washington, the trends actually look different in how they play out on coastal geographies versus inland geographies. So for instance, on average, green crabs are much more abundant where they're found in Pacific coast estuaries with widespread continuous populations. Now, by contrast with the notable exception of folks who have heard of the Sea Pond and the Lummi Reservation, green crabs are relatively much less abundant where they're found inland. And where we do find them, they're not as widespread across the shorelines, but they're relatively restricted or confined in their habitats and distributions. The historic and biogeographic reasons for this distinction bear mentioning because it plays into the patterns of how green crabs are changing and moving over time. So first, the detection of green crab on the coast predates that of inland waters by about 20 years. And the reason that green crabs likely arrived earlier on the coast has to do with the fact that coastal estuaries are more exposed to larvae getting washed in from much larger populations outside the state of Washington. So we currently consider that where Washington is in the overall invasion process is almost like two distinct but very connected invasions, and they look somewhat different. And so now I'm going to dive into more consideration of what it looks like on the coast. So first, this question of relative abundance. What are we talking about when we say crabs are more abundant in coastal estuaries? This map shows the aggregated trapping data from all sites in 2021 across all of those partners that you just saw on that initial slide. Each of these site markers is scaled in size by the relative abundance, and these are expressed as capture rates. On average, how many crabs would you catch if you set about 100 traps? Now, I want to just take a step back to note that capture rate is a good way to track relative abundance and to enable us to compare across sites. But because sites do trap slightly differently, it's not a perfect proxy for either population size, and it does make us a little bit cautious about interpreting differences that are small between sites. So the way we think about it is the sites that have the highest abundances roughly fall in the window of 300 to 1,000 crabs per 100 trap sets. And in 2021, those sites some of the sites that fall into that top group are Macaw Bay, Ocean Shores, and of course, Tokeland. You'll note that only one of those sites is an inland site, that the vast majority of those top sites are concentrated in the coastal estuaries. Now, by contrast, on the other end of the spectrum, I just want to point out that where they're found inland, green crabs are much less abundant, and the sites that have the lowest abundance, in which case 1 crab per 100 trap sets or less, so having to set more than 100 traps to catch even a single crab, are all concentrated inland. In addition, in coastal estuaries, of course, green crabs are widespread across the habitat that's most suitable for them. So to that last figure, I've added black dots to indicate places where traps were set in suitable habitat, but where no green crab detections were made. So this figure highlights that in coastal estuaries, we have very few black dots. That is, very few places that are suitable for green crab, but where we don't actually observe them. Now, by contrast, inland, in most of the places we set traps, we don't catch green crabs. They're seen at only a minority of sites. And I also want to point out that, as Larissa showed some really nice pictures of the habitat types, what we're talking about here in terms of suitable habitat is, some of these protected marsh channels and shoreline, structured shorelines, 3-dimensional structured shorelines that offer some protection for European green crabs. So we don't expect a lot of this open coastal habitat, really open sandy beaches or cobble beaches or rocky bench areas to be the best habitat for green crabs, although you may find them if they're also abundant nearby. Now, of course, those of you looking at this picture will also note that that looks like a lot of places in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor, and that's why, partly why they've been enabled to become so widespread in those geographies. It's also worth mentioning that these patterns are similar across the border in Canada in terms of green crabs being more abundant and widespread in coastal embayments than they are along inland shorelines. Now, what's interesting here is that unlike Washington coastal estuaries, green crabs did establish self-recruiting populations in the fjord-like inlets on the west coast of Vancouver Island, like Barkley Sound and Clayoquot, which are 2 sites that I have data from I'm sharing here, although they are present also further to the north. This is really interesting because those habitats are pretty different physically from Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor, and they're also very open. And yet, because they are so deep, it's likely that there's water retention patterns that enable them to build up populations really quickly in a way that didn't happen in the shallow estuaries on the Washington coast, at least initially. Now, another thing I want to point out is that these populations on the west coast of Vancouver Island are not only larger than inland BC populations, but they're also currently likely larger than the Washington coastal populations at this time anyway. So you may have heard about a very large removal trapping effort in British Columbia. This is, to my knowledge, I think it's actually the first removal trapping effort that has occurred in British Columbia, and it's a group called the Coastal Restoration Society, which has just in the past year started trapping intensively to draw down populations in Clayoquot Sound near Tofino and in Souk Basin. Now, in just for a touch point, in December of this past year, I believe Coastal Restoration Society set something like 640 traps in Clayoquot and captured 72,000 crabs, which, to do the quick math, is about 11,000 crabs per 100 trap sets. It's, you know, on an average of an order of magnitude higher than places we've seen them in Washington. So given that green crabs have been established without intervention in these locations for a couple of decades, the numbers maybe aren't surprising, but they do demonstrate a potential for population growth that we could see as in our areas as well, as to say that our populations might not be yet as big as they could get. And in fact, we have seen the dramatic changes to abundances like Larissa showed that are occurring really over just the past couple of years. Washington is in some ways starting to catch up to Canada pretty quickly. The recent changes in population numbers in Washington reflects a real state change. That is, the patterns that we've seen in the past about presence and failure to detect green crabs, even though sampling was ongoing, have changed categorically, particularly in the last 3 years. So here I'm showing what is probably the only continuous monitoring data set from coastal estuaries going back to the late 1990s when green crabs were first detected. These are data collected from Stakeholder in the north end of Willapa, and data that the monitoring was supported by Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission and largely conducted by Andrea Kimmer in collaboration with Sylvia Yamada at Oregon State University. And so what I want to show is that even though this data is limited in terms of how many sites, it's only a single site, it provides a glimpse into how and why we might be seeing this shift. So what I want to point out is that for 20 years after they were first detected at Stackpole, the pattern was that small waves of green crabs would arrive and die off without evidence that the crabs were able to sustain a population locally. Each of these waves was associated with an El Nino event, one after the other, where crabs would get washed up from Oregon and California, particularly on strong northward currents, and support a mini boom where crabs were periodically detectable in what at the time seemed like large numbers, and now they don't seem like large numbers anymore. But then they would quickly drop off, and in many years, trapping would yield no evidence of green crab. Does that mean that green crabs weren't present in Willapa Bay at all? Not necessarily at all. This was a small trapping effort, and crabs were still being detected by shellfish growers here and there, but the numbers weren't large enough at that time to trigger any detections, which means that populations weren't able to sustain self-recruitment. Now, this has changed a lot in the last 3 years, order of magnitude changes. The causes of the coastal changes in the invasion have also changed from the 20 years before that time. The crabs that we're seeing now, these big peaks, are likely not the result of crabs that have been living in the bay from decades before undetected, but a regional change that is critically impacted by other populations outside the state. So what has changed? Well, we have some indications that populations in Oregon have gotten much larger. Folks have probably heard the news from that state as well. And more sustained over time. They used to have a similar, what we call the boom bust pattern, where they would drop very low in between these peak years. And now their populations are more sustained and continuous as well. So it's possible that in large part, these closer sources of larvae, as in closer than California, have been repeatedly flooding Washington estuaries more so than in the past when they had farther to go to reach us. So these abundance and spread trends are being observed at the site level, right? And I certainly know folks at this meeting don't need any more convincing about the threat of green crabs in coastal estuaries, and we want to talk about action. I'm hearing that very, very clearly in the Q&A. So to my mind, to weigh options as to what actions are likely to pay off, it's helpful, and in fact, I think it's necessary to consider the invasion from a systems perspective, looking across the entire landscape of the region and understanding what processes are driving these patterns. Why are they happening? These crabs here were collected by Kyle Deerkop from Grays Harbor. These crabs, ended up on Kyle's beds, but they came from somewhere. And while their impacts are local to Kyle's beds, they also don't exist in a bubble. So this is where the life cycle of green crabs becomes important to think about. So in trying to understand how green crabs are arriving in various places, where they're coming from, how much local population growth is happening, the life stage that is the main driver of regional changes is really the larval phase here I've shown on the left. As adults, green crabs don't travel very far. So they maintain home ranges on the range of 50 to 100 meters of shoreline. You may hear stories that green crabs have been observed traveling multiple kilometers, and indeed they can, but it's really the exception rather than the rule. Most green crabs as adults have very high sight fidelity on the scale of days, weeks, and even months. Unlike, for instance, Dungeness crabs, which undergo quite long tidal migrations. So if larvae is the driver of movement, what's the traffic like across our waterways? Well, we know that dispersal of larvae from large established populations to the south is what first brought green crabs to Washington, and repeatedly over those first 2 decades. And this continues to be an important source, as I described in the last slide. It's likely that that source is increasing significantly over the last 3 to 5 years. Similar to increases in Willapa Bay in the past few years, as I mentioned, folks of Oregon have observed those increases in adult populations. We also know from ocean modeling that green crabs can come from northern populations to the coast of Washington as well. And lastly, there's evidence that there is weak connectivity in and out of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. That connectivity is biased westward, so there's obviously more water coming out than in. And so population, while the Salish Sea is relatively protected from coastal waters, although not perfectly, there is outward flow through the Strait of Juan de Fuca of larvae from within the Salish Sea, including we have some genetic evidence that green crabs from Souk Basin here in southern British Columbia can be found in Willapa Bay and as far south as Central Oregon. Now, increasingly, in addition to these outside sources, Willapa Bay is likely becoming a source of larvae that fuels population growth within the bay itself. So some of you may be familiar with the predictive work that looked at how larvae might disperse from different release points within Willapa Bay. This is work done by Neil Banas back in the mid-2000s. This heat map of Willapa Bay used an ocean model to look at how likely larvae were to still remain in Willapa Bay at the end of their larval development when they need to settle out of the water column and find a place to live. And it turns out it depends on how they start. So this area in blue, everything north of Long Island essentially, shows that if a female green crab releases her larvae in the northern half of the bay, 95 to 99% of those larvae will get washed out of Willapa Bay before they're old enough to settle. By contrast, nearly all of the larvae that are released in the very southern portions of the bay will be found somewhere within Willapa Bay, not necessarily at this site, but somewhere within the bay when they are large enough to settle. So this dynamic sets up a system where on a per crab basis, females down here in the south end are probably contributing more to overall population growth rates within Willapa Bay than crabs up north. And this work was done back in the early 2000s. And at that time, green crabs weren't being detected in some of those orange, red, and yellow regions down here in the south. Of course, in the past few years, we have seen them show up at those locations. And while those populations are small, they may have a disproportionate influence on population growth within Willapa Bay. So this is all to make the point that Willapa Bay is likely now contending with much more larval pressure from sources within the bay than previously. On the more recent time scale, we're now also able to start tracking much finer scale patterns through the Sentinel site network that's been mentioned a few times. So for folks similar with the inland early detection work of crab team, Sea Grant also recently coordinated the launch of analogous sites across coastal geography starting in 2020. Shoalwater Bay has been an excellent initial launch partner in that, and a number of other folks as well that we're really grateful have contributed time to doing a small amount of trapping that tells us a whole lot. As Larissa pointed out, collecting data takes a lot of time. And so if we can exert smaller data rich efforts, then that will hopefully help provide enough information such that removal trapping can occur in a much more informed way and without having to collect all of the detailed information that's collected on these small trapping scale of a Sentinel site. This network also offers one of the only efforts we currently have that is actually systematically tracking population size over space and time. So this is their trapping in the same way. And so this is a robust way to compare and give us little snapshots of what's going on. So what can these sites tell us so far about where the changes in populations are happening? Are they all at Stackpole? Are they happening everywhere? Well, because the Sentinel program is relatively new, as of yet, we only have data to compare between years for a couple of sites. And I'm showing you here those sites, Ocean Shores, Tokeland, and Nakata. We have data from 2020 and 2021 from 2 months. But nevertheless, we see a strikingly consistent pattern where every sample this year showed a much higher abundance of green crabs than the same time last year. In some cases, the increase was by a factor of 5. So these local changes are really detectable at the site level, and really quite discernible. In addition to year-to-year changes, we're starting to learn about the seasonality of captures. So here I'm showing the monthly capture rate for all 10 Sentinel sites for just 2021. Across these sites, there's definitely variability in terms of what time of year each site saw its peak green crab capture rates. But there is a trend overall across all the sites towards catching more green crabs during the second half of the monitoring season, which is July through September. And it's most apparent, that trend is mostly driven by sites with the greatest relative abundance of green crabs. So it's really interesting that it's not the case that for those sites that have the highest catches all season, like Nakata, Tokeland, and Ocean Shores, that those catch rates are high, have been high all year. But it is the case that, in fact, in April through June, they look pretty similar to a lot of the other geographies. But then come midsummer, the numbers really take off. Why are they taking off like that? There are at least 2 possible reasons. So either there are more crabs at those locations during those months, or the crabs that are already there are more catchable. They're more likely to enter traps, sort of a behavioral change in the population that's there. How do we start to disentangle that and figure out what it means for temporal trends coming up? We really try to provide insight into what's going on with the young of the year cohort. Adult crabs don't migrate very far, as I mentioned, so the most likely way that new crabs would come to the site is through recruitment. Now, as the young of the year grow up to catchable sizes, they start appearing in traps. So here is the size data on all crabs captured at all Sentinel sites in 2021 by date. And so generally the cutoff for what is considered a young of the year is anything under 30 millimeters. As Larissa mentioned, those don't typically come to things, or they don't typically get captured by things like shrimp traps. We typically only see them in other trap types. Though, of course, green crabs will grow larger over the year. If they start out at 30 millimeters this time of year, they may reach closer to 40 later in the season. And certainly if one is trapping October, November, December. So one of the other interesting pieces of information here is that typically with green crab up to this point, young of the year would start to enter traps in late July or August. Here we're clearly seeing young of the year individuals arrive as early as April, and what we're calling a protracted recruitment period, where there's some evidence of that young of the year are around for a much longer part of the season. And this is interesting because it's also observed by other folks. Adriana McCaw has commented on this in her removal trapping, which has been going on since 2017, and Sylvia Yamana in Oregon as well are seeing this. It could be that the increases in density enable crabs to move around more quickly and start recruiting earlier, as well as some of the late season recruitment too. Now, referring back to our last question about whether increased catches indicate more crabs or hungrier crabs, I don't see a lot of evidence here that, you know, recruitment is alone driving the increase in catch rates for those high density sites. If that were the case, I'd expect the signal of these young of the year cohorts to be stronger this time of year, so that by the end of the last few months, those increases were really driven by young of the year. So I've addressed a few aspects of seasonal trends here, and I think it's really relevant because Larissa's is one of the first trapping efforts that's going consistently through the winter. And seeing her numbers stay so high so long is particularly surprising because what I'm showing here is data from 98 through 2001, where monthly trapping did occur for a series of 4 years. And even though the absolute numbers of green crabs was dropping from 98 to 99 to 2000 to 2001, there was still a seasonal trend, even at these low abundance years, where from October through December, catch rates would really drop off. And in January, February, March, it was really hard to find any green crabs during those months. So the shift that is clearly evident, at least in Tokeland and certainly in other locations, is particularly notable. Now, it does fit into what is potentially explained by some of the behavioral aspects of how we think green crab use habitat over the seasons. So green crabs migrate slightly deeper in the intertidal during winter, as the shallower elevations are exposed to colder air temperatures. So if you're only trapping intertidally and you're only looking for green crabs intertidally, it might look like the crabs disappear or you've run out of crabs, when really the crabs have just sort of headed to slightly deeper water. We're not talking, again, on the scale of kilometer migrations. We're talking about on the scale of, you know, a couple hundred meters down to adjacent channels and deeper water. The other part of this is that capture rates do decline because it is just colder. Green crabs have less metabolic demand, and so they're less motivated to come to traps in the winter. So for that reason, when we are trapping in the winter and getting high densities, it likely means that you know, capture rates in the summer would actually be quite a bit higher. Now, just for reference here, I want to point out that the average capture rate during this 4-year period during the April through October season was about 10 crabs per 100 trap sets. This is notice that they used a different denominator here, whereas November to March, it was about 10% of that. So this pattern starts to provide some suggestion of that habitat seasonality, that green crabs could be undergoing small local migrations with the seasons, and that changes where we see them depending on what time of year you're looking at there. And there's been some sense of this for a number of years. Shellfish growers encounter green crabs even when they were sparse within Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor on their beds in greater frequency in colder months. And certainly there's some pretty dramatic recent circumstantial evidence of that as well. Another piece of the puzzle is that where we have trapping data collected simultaneously from shellfish beds and nearby shoreline habitats during the summer, densities of green crabs are higher along the shoreline. So here I'm showing a couple of efforts. This one is out near Bay Center, where we were comparing channel habitats to shellfish beds. And this one is in Nakata and Oysterville here, where slough habitats were compared to a couple of shellfish beds. And there was a consistent pattern where abundances were higher at the shoreline habitats in the summer. What we are eager to find out and learn about now is how these continue to change in the winter, where we have relatively less trapping data. Now that green crabs are more abundant and are showing more of a winter signal, I think it's a good opportunity to learn more about this. Right now, what we have are puzzle pieces that fit together and tell us the story about habitat seasonality, and figuring out how that really works out to what the local impacts on shellfish beds and how that will vary seasonally with temperature and things like that is key to unlocking and predicting some of the impacts on aquaculture. So I want to wrap up before passing it on to my colleague Sean to talk a little bit about management and interpretation for management action, with providing some final thoughts on prospects. So I've talked a lot about how the sustained increase, particularly in the last 3 years, indicates a state shift on the coast. The larval pressure from coastal sites is higher than it's ever been, and it's still likely increasing both from outside and likely inside the estuaries as populations within the estuaries grow as well. Coastal and inland populations could get much, much larger. We've seen them be large elsewhere. We haven't reached what is likely what you might call carrying capacity or equilibrium or anything like that. The impacts will increase as populations grow. In the past 20 years, none of the densities that were observed were large enough populations to result in measurable impacts. Those are, relatively small compared to what we're seeing now. However, now these order of magnitude larger populations are, they all have to eat something. And so it's and trying to understand what that is and how it changes with seasons and their habitat use is really important. Sean's going to talk a little bit more about an ongoing project to that effect. And then lastly, this improving our ongoing understanding of how populations move and connect is really the key to making progress in control efforts. And so I'm really grateful to all the folks, again, who have helped us come as far as we have. So now I'm going to take a pause and allow my colleague Sean to share his slides and give a talk before breaking for Q&A.
Hello, thank you so much, Emily. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. As always, Emily has done an excellent job of providing that landscape for me and makes my job just a little bit easier. So thank you so much, Emily. Although you are a hard act to follow. So hopefully everyone can see my screen and I'm sharing the correct screen. Is that correct? Thumbs up or something? I want to make sure I'm providing.
Looks great, Sean.
Right view. Okay, thank you so much. All right, well, thank you everybody. My name is Sean McDonald and I'm a faculty member in the program on the environment in the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences at the University of Washington, and also a member of Crab Team. And my job here today is to take what Liz just shared with you and perhaps help contextualize it a little bit, interpret it for management purposes or how it might be relevant to management. Now, I say that as a scientist, as an ecologist, and not as a manager. Obviously, the role of management falls to Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife as the lead agency, along with tribal co-managers of the tribes, and of course with the input of all the stakeholders that are being affected by the spread of invasive European green crab in our waters. And certainly out on the coast, that has been a tremendous issue. And I normally start my portion of this talk showing a video of just how bad it can get on the U.S. East Coast, but I think in many places we're starting to see much more. We're seeing much higher numbers. I know folks in Willapa Bay can attest to that, and those folks on the outer coast of Vancouver Island have seen it as well. So I'm not sure I need to show that video now. But as I said, I do want to talk about interpretation for management. And to do that, I want to break up what I'll discuss into sort of three main buckets or ideas. This idea of how the ecology and biology relates to goals of management, how it relates to some particular strategies, and then the tactics we might use to enact those strategies. All right, so let me begin. Emily has already given a great overview of differences between what's going on in inland shores and out on the outer coast. These are very different invasions because of the relative abundance, because of geography, the time period of first detection, and exposure to larval input, which is of course much, much higher on the outer coast. And so I won't go into any detail other than to say both areas we're seeing an increase in abundance and ongoing spread. So obviously active management is necessary. But these distinct differences also lead to needing to describe discrete management plans or developing discrete management plans for the inland waters and the coastal waters. And so as part of that, we need to identify particular management goals. And usually when we talk about management goals for European green crab, we think of these three being primary ones. And I think that at the outset, my WDFW colleagues had talked about some of these goals. So we want to prevent additional invasions. We want to eliminate all European green crab whenever possible. Eradication is a goal. And when eradication is not feasible, we want to try to reduce harm and impact as much as we possibly can. Before I go any further into telling you about how you might enact these goals, I just mentioned the discrete management plans for inland waters and coastal waters, but Emily pointed out to you all that we see a high degree, although these are discrete and different invasions, there is some degree of communication between inland waters and the coast. And we know of this in part because of oceanographic modeling work that's been done, but also through some of the really excellent genetic work that our colleague Carolyn Teppold has done, where she's been able to identify the signature of coastal green crab, as well as the sook population shown in green, which is slightly distinct. And we've seen patterns of coastal green crab DNA in the inland waters. We've also seen evidence of the sook population in inland waters. But you know, the strait flows two ways, as Emily likes to say, and at the same time, we are seeing some evidence of the sook population on the outer coast too. And so even though we want to think about these as discrete areas for management, that management needs to be coordinated because of that occasional weak connectivity that is occurring where particularly larvae are spreading between these two distinct areas. All right, so the first management goal to prevent additional invasion. Now, oftentimes this one seems like a head scratcher to folks when we already have green crab in the area. Why would we want to prevent, or why do we need to prevent additional invasions? Emily highlighted the larval life cycle, the planktonic life cycle of green crab. They spread on planktonic, they spread by on ocean currents via plankton, and primarily they've spread up the coast via this method. They've also spread around the world in the ballast water of ships or in the shipment of shellfish or seafood products. And certainly we want to prevent additional spread to our area by any of these mechanisms. So that should be a primary concern, and WDFW and others are working hard to prevent additional invasions to our area. Part of the reason that we want to do that is to prevent the addition of new genetic material to the population. And I'll explain why that's important, right? Why do we want to limit new genetic material to the green crab populations that are already here. And evidence for that comes from the US East Coast up in the Northeast. What you're looking at is a map of Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, into the Canadian Maritimes. Before the 1980s, green crab populations had more or less stalled out along the Central Scotian shelf around Halifax. So basically, they weren't moving any farther north. And the idea there, or the hypothesis was, it was just too cold in the winter to sustain green crab populations. So that was preventing a barrier to them spreading any farther northward. Then in roughly the early 1990s, Cape Breton was rapidly colonized and northward expansion occurred very quickly. Now, at first that was surprising, but subsequent genetic testing revealed that this was actually the result of a secondary invasion. So what you're looking at here, these pie charts, are the degree of the southern variant and the degree of the northern variant, as well as a hybrid zone. So essentially, the earliest invasion to the US East Coast was from somewhere in southern Europe, and that population spread northward until it reached more or less a northern maximum, which was partially described by the water temperature there. Then much later, there was an additional invasion from northern Europe, and those cold adapted northern green crab were able to expand the range. Additionally, the southern and the northern populations came together and formed what's called sort of this hybrid form, which is also quite robust. And so this additional invasion actually allowed green crab to expand much, much further than they would have otherwise. As an additional side note, which is disturbing as well, the northern variant seems to be, by some accounts, much more aggressive than the southern variant. And although it is hard to believe that anything coming from Canada would be highly aggressive, that seems to be the case here. Fortunately, on the US West Coast, we only have the southern variant. We don't have the northern variant. And so ideally, we'd like to prevent that from happening. All right. So, in terms of additional goals, though, of course, we want to eliminate all AGC and we want to reduce impacts. And I'll come back to that in a second. Looks like my slides might have gotten slightly out of order. But when we move beyond those goals, we want to look at very specific strategies to actually enact those goals. And so obviously we want to eliminate all green crab. One of the first things we want to think about is eradication as a strategy. And what I'm showing you on the right-hand side is a flow chart from a really useful paper by Stephanie Green and Ted Groschholz that depicts a pathway, a flow chart, if you will, for making decisions about management strategies. Eradication is typically the most critical management strategy to be considered. It's one that we oftentimes think of first. We want to try to eliminate all green crab where we can. It's a fairly simple strategy in theory, but it's actually quite complicated in practice, because you have to consider the habitat, the behavior, and the susceptibility of the crabs by season and reproductive stage, as well as non-target impacts of any of your tactics that you use. So that is oftentimes the first strategy that we consider. Another strategy that is often considered is containment. So can we contain spread and reduce retention? That's an important management strategy. And here it's shown in orange on the Green and Groschholz flow chart. Now, for those of you who tuned in on Tuesday, and maybe heard from Emily a little bit earlier about Lummi Sea Pond, that is an area up here in northern Puget Sound that we're particularly worried about in terms of retention. The Lummi Sea Pond is what we might think of as a very effective incubator for green crab, and that is that allows the green crab population there to, or has allowed the green crab population there to expand very, very rapidly over 3 years. This is not unlike what we have seen in Central California. On the left, you're seeing the Redwood Shores Lagoon. It's a human-made residential lagoon in the southern bay there in San Francisco. It's also considered sort of the birthplace or ground zero of the West Coast invasion of European green crab. Over just a few years, green crab were able to expand and become incredibly abundant quite quickly. It went from, I think, in 1 year to being present to being in the thousands within a season. On the right, you see an area called Seadrift Lagoon. It's actually this small, interesting shape adjacent to the much larger Bolinas Lagoon. And you may have heard about Seadrift Lagoon in the news as of recently. It's a place where green crab are extremely abundant. By 2013, the population you've probably heard about this because of a failed experiment where there was an effort to eradicate green crab from this lagoon. And by about 2013, the population there through this eradication effort had decreased from about 125,000 crabs to about 10,000 individuals. But 1 year later, in 2014, the population exploded to about 300,000 crabs. That was a 30-fold increase over the 2013 levels. This phenomenon that I just described, where there's a rapid bounce back in the population, is actually called overcompensation. And you probably have heard about that in discussions about how we might control green crab. The reason that overcompensation occurred in Seadrift Lagoon was specifically because of the dynamics of the population within that lagoon structure. Basically, green crab, adult green crab, were the only real predator, the dominant predator within Seadrift Lagoon. And then what that essentially means is that by eliminating the dominant predator, that allowed for much higher survival of juvenile green crab, leading to that population rebound. Overcompensation is certainly something that we are concerned about in places like Lummi Sea Pond. However, on the outer coast, it is really much less of a concern. Oh, excuse me, I went going the wrong way. It's much less of a concern, although we are still concerned about topics like retention. Emily did a great job of describing some work that Neil Banas and I did back in the early 2000s, looking at the possibility of larval retention within Willapa Bay. As she pointed out very correctly, in the northern part of the bay, most larvae that are produced there are going to be exported from the bay. But when we get into the southern portion of the bay, especially the area termed sort of Shoalwater Bay down there at the very end, any larvae that are produced there are much more likely to be retained within the bay. So if you just thought of this on a per female basis, a female in the southern portion of the bay is going to be contributing much more to increasing the population size within Willapa Bay than a female upwards near Stackpole or Toke Point. And again, just thinking about what we've seen in 2021 with numbers growing, then clearly if you want to have a management strategy that favors containing retention or limiting retention rather in Willapa Bay, effort would need to be allocated to that southern portion of the bay to prevent that from occurring. An additional management strategy that's often encouraged is suppression. Now, suppression is usually, as you can see from the flow chart, an option when eradication is deemed to be ineffective or not effective or not feasible, not possible. So here in the green and grow Schultz figure that's shown in red, I have a little box around it. And this is a strategy that has been utilized to some extent on the U.S. East Coast. What you're seeing here is a picture of clammers in Maine that are taking part in the 5 to Stay Alive program. The idea there is to engage stakeholders and primarily clammers in removing at least 5 green crab a day on average from particular grounds or beds that they want to protect. Functional eradication as an idea is relatively new, but basically what it essentially saying is we want to reduce green crab to the point where they're no longer producing significant ecological impacts or economic harm. And as I said, it's a relatively new concept that Green and Groschultz describe in their paper. I want to go into a little bit more detail about that though, and step you through what that might actually look like. So how would you actually enact some sort of suppression by functional eradication? Well, in order to do that, you first have to identify or determine the ecological or economic resources that you want to protect. So this could be particularly sensitive habitat areas. It could be shellfish resources or particularly fertile growing areas for aquaculture. It's then necessary to understand the change or impact on that resource as a function of green crab population density. So that's sort of the per capita impact. How much of an impact are green crab having at any given density? And then based on that information, managers then can select an appropriate threshold density of green crabs to limit impact, basically the ceiling that you want to put in place for green crab density. And because this is an incredibly resource intensive process, it's important to identify high priority locations to carry out the functional eradication effort. Again, this might be very discrete habitat types or growing beds or other sensitive habitat areas. Next step is to perform targeted removal in a very intensive fashion using the best tactics available. And I'll describe some of those tactics in a few minutes. And then eventually assess the progress and adjust your efforts as appropriate to try and keep the density under that threshold. So that's basically functional eradication in a nutshell. So I mentioned tactics that could be used for achieving functional eradication or really achieving any of those goals that I just discussed. And tactics when it comes to European green crab management really are divvied up into 3 sort of categories: biological, chemical, and mechanical. And these have been explored by numerous authors over the years, including a really big workshop that was conducted all the way back in 2004 to look at this for Australia. The first tactic, as I said, is biological, and one of the common ways that biological control or biocontrol is achieved is by introducing parasites or pathogens. We see this across a broad range of invasive species, and it's been attempted in many different places. For European green crab, one approach has been to test for the use of a rhizocephalan parasite called Saculina. For those of you unfamiliar with rhizocephalan parasites, I won't go into a whole lot of biology, but if you've ever seen the movie Alien with Sigourney Weaver, it's basically the same concept. They're somewhat terrifying critters that infiltrate the crab's body, take it over, and modify their behavior and their reproductive life. They're a castrating parasite, meaning that they basically stop all of the reproduction of those individuals, which is really effective for limiting population growth. Unfortunately, when that has been tested here on the US West Coast in laboratory settings, it's been found that it has pretty tremendously severe non-target impacts, so significant non-target impacts, particularly with Dungeness crab, when you put the Saculina parasites, when you expose Dungeness crab rather to the Saculina parasites, essentially kills all of the Dungeness crab. So it's a pretty nasty parasite, and one that we wouldn't want to introduce on this coast because it would have substantial non-target impacts. The next tactic that we might consider, or that has been considered, is chemical or pesticide applications to kill green crab. And this has been explored most significantly by the Australian government. They have explored the use of 48 different compounds and evaluated those with a variety of techniques. The most common are things like aerial spraying or hand spraying, as well as putting out poison bait. With any sort of chemical application, obviously there are some limitations that can include trying to achieve the appropriate application concentration and addressing significant non-target impacts. For places like Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor, that would be non-target impacts to Dungeness crab resources and other crab resources there. And I know that in Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor, in Washington in general, we do have a history of using pesticides for invasive species management, for instance, with Spartina removal. The question is whether or not Spartina is a really analogous example. Obviously, Spartina very conspicuous, especially when it's forming large aggregations or meadows, and of course it's non-mobile, and so that allows you to apply an herbicide in this case to a large swaths rather efficiently. It becomes much harder when those patches are more dispersed in the landscape, as many folks in this call are probably aware. There's obviously other concerns and constraints as well. Another tactic that's often used is mechanical methods, and in the case of green crab, that's often trapping. Trapping is seen as a fairly common and effective approach. And while the technology, the crab trap, is pretty simple, it is pretty, as I said, pretty effective. In part, it's because non-target impacts are largely minimized. Most non-target species can be released alive. The gear and resources necessary are relatively inexpensive, and the techniques require fairly limited training. Along the West Coast of the US, there are not a lot of really great examples of using trapping effectively. We are doing some good work in the Salish Sea, where the populations are very small, but on the coast, because of other issues, including the transport of larvae and larval inputs and recruitment, we don't see as many examples on the West Coast. The best example is from Bodega Bay Harbor. This is down in Central California, about, I think it's just around 60 miles north of San Francisco. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Bodega Bay Harbor, it was the scene for Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. In this particular case, there was an intensive trapping effort undertaken to try and eradicate green crab from this harbor using only baited traps, or using primarily baited traps and other mechanical means. This is work done by a large group of authors, including Turner et al. And so what I'm showing you here is the early portion of that eradication effort, or I should say their pre-eradication sampling. And you're looking at the average number of green crab, the average daily CPV per site. And in this case, you're looking at, in the first column, Bodega Harbor, which was the target site, as well as two reference sites, Elkhorn Slough and Tamales Bay. And so this was the catch per unit effort of green crab prior to the eradication effort. And then here it is in subsequent years as well. And so a couple of major takeaways. The red arrows, I just want to highlight for you the area where the eradication effort took place. Within 1 year, with extensive effort, I mean, really a tremendous effort, the group was able to reduce adult green crab catch by 85%. And they were able to keep that catch down over the 3 years of the particular project. So that was deemed pretty successful. A couple of takeaways though that I do want you to pay attention to. First of all, the catch declined dramatically in the reference bays as well. And so they were likely getting some help from Mother Nature over the years 2007, 2008, and 2009. So Mother Nature helped them out a little bit by keeping green crab down. Also, as the adult catch declined, they did see quite a substantial influx of juveniles, and that's somewhat to be expected, in that there weren't as many adults coming to the traps, so that was allowing them to catch more juveniles, but it also indicates that there were substantial recruitment to Bodega Bay Harbor. And so even as they were putting in this tremendous effort, they were seeing continual influx of larvae from other areas in Central California and probably also from Oregon as well. And the last thing that I want to point out, and it's probably really germane to the topic of our coastal estuaries, is sort of putting this tremendous effort in this one place in the context of what sort of the area we're talking about on Washington's outer coast. So just to give you a sense of size and scale. So could you pull this same level of effort off? This is just scaling the size of Bodega Bay Harbor to the size of, in this case, Gray's Harbor. So you get a sense of the area that they were trying to work in, and that was really a substantial effort. I've already seen some questions in the chat about pheromones, and I just want to point that out as another tactic that's been used to attract green crab and try to aggregate them. It's something that's being explored now. You know, as I say, we're using traps that are baited with fish in most cases. Could you use pheromones to attract green crab? For those of you unfamiliar with pheromones, they're chemical compounds that animals produce naturally that affect their behavior. And in the case of green crabs, pheromones released by both males and females control the molting cycle and allow them to find each other to mate, and actually really control the entire courtship process and mating process. So could we develop a pheromone that would attract crabs that might be, for instance, more effective than bait? It's a really good question and one that's being actively explored. There are some limitations, however. First of all, right now, the chemicals that are being tried, or the compounds that are being developed now, have real problems with stability in terms of pH and temperature. So that's something to consider. The researchers working on this haven't been able to deliver a product that actually is maintaining its efficacy over time, over a range of temperatures and a range of pHs. Also, detection distance seems to be an issue. And that makes some sense, really. For the crabs, pheromones are really meant to work on the order of meters, right? So these animals who are in close proximity to each other can find each other and mate. And so whether or not you would actually be able to attract green crab over long distances remains to be seen. And then lastly, cost. This is a fairly expensive process. When you consider how much bait costs, the process of producing pheromone attractants is substantially more expensive. Last thing I want to talk about is harvest incentives is another tactic, because that's something that's talked about a lot. Susan Pascoe and Jason Goldberg reviewed this for a wide variety of invasive species, and these are just a couple of ideas that they hit on: developing commercial markets, establishing a recreational harvest, bounty programs, and contract operations. All of these have been tried to some extent with green crabs around the world. And I just want to go into a couple of them just to highlight some of their perhaps advantages and limitations. So the first is establishing either a commercial market or recreational harvest. As WDFW colleagues mentioned at the outset, green crabs are a prohibited level 1 species, so it's not legal to possess them. That's one obstacle. But really, other things we want to be very careful about are incentivizing either the intentional or unintentional spread of green crabs elsewhere. That's one big issue. The other thing is that green crab at their highest densities and highest abundances really are not in places where either commercial crabbers are operating or where recreational harvesters would want to go. And this is especially true when we think about areas we might want to target, thinking about, for instance, the southern end of Willapa Bay. In the case of a commercial market, there really is no demand for green crab. And although folks on the US East Coast have been trying mightily to establish a market, it's definitely nothing compared to our native species here, like Dungeness crab, for instance. And in the case of a recreational fishery, it's really important to note that green crab are relatively small and that the conventional gear used by recreational harvesters currently is not suitable for catching green crab. They would just slip out of the escape ring and largely through the mesh. And so that would be an additional issue with establishing any sort of recreational harvest without changing the gear, and then that would increase bycatch and other issues. Bounty programs have also been explored, and they're sort of a special case, and they've met with sort of mixed success among invasive species programs. You have to consider, of course, not only animal behavior and population dynamics and non-target impacts, but you also have to consider human behavior and economics and the economic incentives of bounties. And so they have not actually overall been very successful in a lot of places where they've been tried. Again, the economic incentive is to retain as many of the target species as possible. In some areas around the world, there have been unintended consequences, including fraud and intentional introductions. But also in terms of management, there is a strong incentive for bounty hunters not to hunt bounties in places where the density is diminishing, right? So they're going to go to places where there are a lot of crabs, which means that as the density or abundance decreases, there's less incentive for folks to want to go out and collect those bounties. An alternative would be to use something like some sort of contract operation, where in that case contractors could be trained and they could be they could actually target particular areas that the management plan would want to target. All right, so just to summarize with the few minutes that I have left, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. I just want to say that region appropriate management options must be considered. Obviously, there's good reason for us to have discrete management in the inland waters and on the outer coast, but there should be some cooperation, communication between those management plans. There's strong evidence for continued trapping as a tactic, and we just need to be very careful about how we use it and use it wisely. Washington really can learn from the experiences of other jurisdictions elsewhere. Green crab have spread around the world, and a lot of different groups have attempted to manage them. And I think that we can learn from both the successes and failures elsewhere. And then also, I just want to mention that the continued monitoring that so many groups are doing out on the coast has been immensely helpful for allowing us to track these patterns. And that will continue to be really important, as well as additional research. I mentioned genetics research and some of the oceanographic modeling. Emily wanted to remind me to tell you all about some ongoing research we have looking at the impacts of green crab through diet analysis. That's an ongoing project with Mary Fisher at the University of Washington and others. She's using a combination of physical diet analysis, so actually looking in the stomachs of crabs, as well as some eDNA techniques. And that work is looking really promising as an approach, as a method to determine what green crab are eating and for evaluating the kinds of impacts they're having, both on the high shore and in aquaculture areas like clam beds. Mary wanted me to pass on that she is about 50% through all of the necessary dissections of the over 100 crabs she is analyzing. and she hopes to have results of that work in the coming months. And with that, I will say thank you for your time. If you have questions for me, you can certainly email me at psean@uw.edu, or you can email CRAB team, and please check out our website at Washington Sea Grant's site. There's the CRAB team. So thank you so much, and I will take questions. Or I should say, Emily and I can take questions perhaps.
Thank you, Sean and Emily. That was great. We've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A, some of which I think we can get to now, and some that we'll save for the panel discussion at the end. One of the ones I wanted to start with is there was a question from Josh early on about just how deep European green crabs have been encountered in Washington waters. Emily, could you take that one?
Yeah, I'll start with it, but actually I think this is also one we're going to be increasingly crowdsourcing from all of the people doing trapping, because I think it is likely that this is something that's going to change over time as green crabs become more abundant and start sort of spilling over from the best habitats in the summer season being intertidal and spilling over to sustain populations more lower intertidal, subtidally. Sean probably has some of the stats in his head on depth distribution. And
I have a few. I have a few. I mean, yeah. So really, Emily points out that well. So first of all, they are a European shore crab. So their center of distribution typically is high shore or mid shore. But at least in European waters, they're found to depths of over 150 feet. That's whether they are found there, they are certainly more abundant in shallow areas. On the West Coast, what we've observed so far is that they're quite plastic in their habitat use and their depth range. And as Lily says, we will be continuing to crowdsource this as more of us are out there catching green crab, and especially if we're looking across a depth range, which is one of the reasons why continued monitoring and prospecting is useful, because we can look at areas not necessarily where they're most abundant, but where we might be able to see if they've expanded.
Great, thank you. And again, if folks have questions and they're on the phone, you can shoot us an email, or you can follow up with Chelsea or I afterwards. And if we didn't get your question answered, we're happy to engage with you. We had a couple questions in the Q&A about sites outside Willapa Bay and the status of green crabs in Grays Harbor, and then also the Columbia estuary, and if there's any information available on what's going on in the lower Columbia. Is there any information that either of you could share on either of those estuaries?
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide more detail. There's so much trapping going on and so much information to share that it's, even with fairly detailed presentation, it's easy to sort of not be able to cover all of the details. So first off, I want to talk about the Columbia estuary. This was a site of real concern this past year because it, seems like there could be enough saltwater influence to allow for green crabs to survive. So in fact, there was a trapping effort there over the past year, but that Chelsea, Ron, and Alex largely led, that trapped a number of sites at the lower end of the Columbia on the Washington side, and didn't capture any European green crabs in the traps that they set. There were some absence points on my map that show you where those were, but I should have paused to point those out and mark that those were up there. However, I will say that during that effort, there were two young crabs that were hand captured in what I believe is called Waikiki Beach Lagoon at the very lower end of the Columbia. So they didn't show up in traps, but there were a couple of crabs that were visible there. In Grays Harbor, to provide a little bit more detail, we see, I shared a lot of detail on Willapa in part because the duration of detections and the data available over the course of the years is a little richer there, but I think a lot of the same patterns hold in Grays Harbor. For one, the abundance of green crabs is typically higher at sites that are closer to the mouth of Grays Harbor than further up. So in trapping that's been done up the Chehalis River up through one of our sentinel sites at Aberdeen, folks have been able to capture European green crabs. However, if you continue up that river, you start to get too fresh for green water for green crabs. And I think, some of the other patterns are similar in terms of green crabs being sort of relatively widespread across those habitats. A lot of trapping around the edges, both north and south up the Johns River in Grays Harbor have yielded evidence of widespread green crabs. Yeah, those are some trends that come to mind. I think some of the folks on the panel later will also have some great observations to share.
Sean, anything else you want to jump in there?
Oh, no. As Emily points out, I think that some of the panelists later will also have some great observations.
Great. And thanks to Josh from British Columbia on the Q&A, who mentioned that the deepest they've encountered green crabs in Clayoquot Sound is as much as 200 feet. And we know that they've been caught in similar, maybe not quite that deep, but at surprising depths up in Macaw Bay. And that leads me to another question that came in on the chat, which is there any information on other river mouths up and down the Washington coast about the presence of green crab? We know that they're in Macaw Bay, up on the Macaw Nation. Anything else you'd like to share about other documentations on the coast?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, with a couple of partners, Quileute Tribe did a little bit of independent trapping this past year. So actually quite a fair number of traps at the mouth of the river there and did not detect any European green crabs, as well as Alex went out and did an intrepid trapping effort at the mouth of the Ozette River. It's not on the ground. It's not a particularly suitable habitat for green crab and didn't manage to find any green crab there, which is good news. And there's a third river that I'm forgetting, so we're going to have to ping source Alex's mind there about the third river mouth that was trapped. Those are the places. That's a really good question, because those are the places across the coastal landscape between between Grays Harbor and Macaw Bay that we would consider amidst those like sandy beaches and really open habitats that aren't as good. So those are the places that we would think that green crab could do the best. So the fact that they haven't yet been detected in those locations is good news, that those sites might be relatively protected by a lot of freshwater flow. Freshwater flow regimes that may just make it really inhospitable for green crab, at least at the propagule levels that are being seen now.
Thank you. There's a couple questions in the chat about management and implications for aquaculture growers, as well as coordination with the State Department of Agriculture and the Washington Invasive Species Council. I think there's a couple folks from both those agencies on this webinar today. Alan is going to get to those. Alan Boyce from WDFW is going to cover some of those topics in his presentation after break, and we'll also cover some of that during the panel discussion. So I'm going to save those questions for now. There was one question from Linda about just asking if you could expand a bit, either of you, on whether Oregon DNA is showing up in the crabs in the coastal bays to confirm the theory that increases are in part due to larval pressure from Oregon. Any other additional information you can share on that?
Well, yeah, I'll just speak up, and then Emily, you can correct me when I'm wrong. But no, the truth is that the DNA of coastal crabs is fairly mixed, in that there really isn't a way for us to identify a genetic signature of Oregon crabs. In fact, more or less, the crabs from Central California all the way up through the outer coast of Vancouver Island genetically appear quite similar. There are only a few distinct sort of subpopulations, if you will. There's the Sea Drift Lagoon population, which I showed. That's a very isolated population that was heavily bottlenecked. So there's a lot of reproductive isolation occurring there. And then also the Souk Basin population on Vancouver Island, which I highlighted as that green dot on my map. That's another place where we've seen a distinct genetic signature. But otherwise, the rest of the coast is all fairly homogeneous.
Thank you. And thanks to Alexander in the chat, who reminded us that the Queets River mouth was another location where they were found. Any additional information that you can share about salinity tolerances for green crab? I know Emily just mentioned this in the Chehalis, but is there any markers that we're aware of as far as where that line might be?
That's a really good question. It's tricky to, green crabs have a lot of behavioral adaptations to widely variable salinity regimes on like a daily, hourly basis, both behavioral and physiological. So if you think about, living at the mouth of a river during a change in tide, you vertically go through wide swings in salinity as, a saltwater wedge will push fresh water back up. And so if you're a green crab at a particular height, you can change your salinity by changing where vertically in that area you are. If it gets too fresh, you can actually sort of hunker down for at least some short period of time in refuge habitat, such as in banks that may be a little bit more protected from that freshwater flow. So a point measurement of some location of where green crab can survive or tolerate long periods of time is going to change depending on the season as well, and what the flow of the water is, and any inputs from the entire watershed, whether it's rain-fed or glacial. So the likely sort of points in the river that are the best for green crabs will shift over seasons as those factors influence. And we may see annual trends where green crabs can work their way up a river as river flow drops over the season, but then over the winter, if there are large releases, that the freshwater sort of flushes them out a little at a time on a sort of annual basis. It's something that we're still sort of constructing our understanding of, but because green crabs generally have such a greater freshwater tolerance than most of our other native crab species, they have a unique chance to work their way up rivers in places that certainly Dungeness crab don't tolerate very well.
Thank you. We've got a bunch of great questions in the Q&A, and we're going to save the rest of them for the panel discussion, which will happen later in the agenda today. We're going to take a 10-minute break. So if folks need to get up and walk around, use the restroom, this is a good time to do so. I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea, who's got a slideshow for our intermission with some photos of folks hard at work trapping green crabs in Willapa Bay, Drayton Harbor, and other areas around the region. And we'll come back at 3:20 for Alan's presentation on green crab emergency management. Chelsea, thank you. All right, well, welcome back, folks. I did want to clarify from Alexandra in the Q&A that she wanted to note that they did trap at the Queets River mouth in partnership with the Queets tribe and Quinault Nation, and no European green crabs were detected there, but they did capture one green crab a little bit to the south in the Copalis River estuary. Thanks for that clarification. We're going to turn it over to Alan Pleus now with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to talk about European green crab emergency management and some of the strategies going forward. Take it away, Alan.
Great. Thank you very much, Chase. And really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk to you about the green crab management that's going on in the state. I'm Alan Pleus. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Unit Manager for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we're here as green crab are posing imminent danger to our state waters, coast and Salish Sea. And we've detected that in coordination with our tribal co-managers, Washington Sea Grant, shellfish growers, and other partners. And so as we've been discussing today, those hot spots that we've seen, Lummi Sea Pond and the outer coast is Macaw, Grace Harbor, Willapa Bay. So that this new information indicated an escalating danger of green crab, seriously threatening the environment, the economy, and human well-being of the state of Washington. So in response to that, Governor Inslee on January 19th issued a proclamation. And in that proclamation, he cited that the ongoing and expanding European green crab infestation poses an imminent danger to Washington State's marine environment, marine-based economy, and the cultural well-being of both tribes and non-tribal residents. The costs of the delay in counteracting this infestation are unacceptably high. This is a statewide declaration. It's not specific to the Salish Sea. It's not specific just to the coast. It's a statewide proclamation. So then the proclamation goes on that he ordered the Department of Fish and Wildlife to begin implementation of emergency measures as necessary to effect the eradication of or to prevent the permanent establishment of an expansion of European green crab. So where are we going with that? As we've as noted before in previous presentations, we have our foundational document, the Salish Sea Transboundary Action Plan, that was developed and signed back in 2019. That was in response to understanding that the management is a transboundary issue with Canada. So we worked with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada on developing this. It's a great framework, but it needs to be updated. And as we've talked again, it's very much based on collaborative management, resource protection, prevention, early detection, really focusing to try to get to more local removal and control, transboundary cooperation, research and adaptive management. Many of these themes and actions are being repeated consistently today. Again, another map that you've seen, but just wanted to reiterate, we're looking at two different management areas, the coastal area and the Salish Sea area. Again, you've heard many arguments why there's a difference. There's different invasion, there are different invasion types that are going on. There's different reasons why the Salish Sea needs to be managed differently than the coast. These are just the facts, and we just need to address those as we can. But luckily, we have great partnerships with Washington Sea Grant, tribal co-managers, other partners out there. And so we have already developed a very comprehensive, wide-scale geographic scope. So again, the main action areas are identified in red. And then the orange squares, that's all that early detection monitoring sites that Washington Sea Grant manages. And there are also the sentinel sites out on the coast. And then the yellow circles are where our tribal co-managers or partners are working. And I'm sure there's other dots and squares that we could put on there, but it shows that we've already developed a very comprehensive scope of work in this scenario. A compilation of the different sites and how many green crab have been were captured in 2021. And with a map there that also gives a CPU capture per unit effort comparisons. Again, just look at those comparisons in relative, as well as look at the populations and the number of captures relative to each site. And you can see where the hot spots are that we've detected, including the Lummi Sea Pond with over 86,000 green crab collected in 2021, over 1,400 in Macaw Bay, Willapa Bay over 10,000, and Grays Harbor over 4,000. These numbers are still coming in. We're still collating it. So as we get more information, we'll try to keep things updated. But just look at it in the relative sense of where we're at, as well as the CPUE between the different areas. The Lummi Sea Pond at 415, Macaw Bay at 330, Willapa Bay at 343, 208 for Grays Harbor. Again, these are comparisons for the entire 2021 season. So comparing these things is often challenging, but look at the other CPUEs of these other sites. They're in the single digits. That's the big difference here. That's why we're looking at it. And that's why we went to the governor's office and requested that he declare an emergency back in December of last year. And he agreed, and that's why we have the proclamation and we're moving forward. So as part of that, we've requested funding, and this is a very critical part of the emergency measures. We have a very good infrastructure. We have all the legislative authorities that we need to move forward. What we don't have is the funding. And so in this situation, we're looking at trying to provide supplemental funding for the rest of this biennium. A big chunk of that, over $2.4 million, will be for the rest of this fiscal year to the end of June, and then another over $6 million for the fiscal year 23, which is July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. This is a big lift and a big effort. And our number one priority right now is to continue working with the legislature to convince them that this full funding is really, really necessary at all scales. So what I want to do right now is just walk through each line and talk to you what that is buying. So for the WDFW EGC statewide line, this would significantly and quickly ramp up our capacity for a comprehensive and coordinated approach that engages our tribal co-managers, Washington Sea Grant, local, state, and federal agencies, shellfish growers, and other stakeholders to work on the short and long-term regional and statewide actions. And it also provides funding to contract policy forum facilitation. Policy is a huge aspect of this, and we have requested funds for policy for several years, and we have not been able to receive that. It's all been money to get the boots in the mud, which is very important. But as we all know, there's a lot of what are we doing? How are we doing it? How is this communication happening? And that's a critical aspect that we continue to move forward and try to get the funding to be able to do. It's a big job, and we need that there. This also, when we talk about our capacity, it would ramp up, for example, on the coast. The funding that we had previously provided 2 FTE for the coast. This new funding would add to that, and we would have at least seven staff that would be dedicated to the coast in that funding package. That's a really important aspect to support you on the coast in doing the management. We're not intended to be just the DFW out on the coast. This is going to help in the coordination, the collaboration, getting the traps out, getting the training, hitting those hot spots, and all those key things. So here's another very important part of this proposal, and that is development of a coastal green crab management grant. We couldn't identify in the time that we needed to pull this funding proposal together each individual line item that would be necessary to attempt an eradication or the control on the coast. So we propose this $500,000 a year basically for a grant program that would that could be accessed by tribes, stakeholders, partners on the coast to facilitate local management. This would be prioritized by local entities. It is run through the department, but it would be mostly managed through a local entity. We haven't identified that. We are encouraging you to identify what those local entities would be to create a program, that could, once this money comes through, identify where that money is going to go. What are the priorities? Is that 2 groups, one in Willapa Bay, one in Grace Harbor, one for the rest of the coast? We don't know. That's something we need your support to identify. Another one is as you've seen with Chase, we're stepping up a huge amount in our public affairs, education outreach, and he's going to talk a little bit more about that in the next session. So I'm not going to cover this too much. Lummi Nation, again, that's a very hot spot, a high concern area within the Salish Sea. And what we're looking there is supporting them through this money to put out hopefully about 1,500 traps and managing those traps on a 7-day per week level. That's the scale that we think is necessary in order to bring down the risk while longer term management options are identified. Macaw Tribe, likewise, they're another hotspot. They need funding to work in that area. And so additional funding is going to be directed to them to help. Again, when we're talking about these, there's a lot of rapidly evolving knowledge in green crab. We are starting to use more boat-based trapping, for example. Previously, it was all shore-based. Now we're understanding those crabs do go out into deeper waters, especially in the wintertime. You can't do shore-based trapping in the wintertime. We're going to need more boat-based. We're going to need more things. This stuff is rapidly expanding and evolving, and we're trying to address that as quickly as possible. Washington Sea Grant, as you've seen with Emily and Sean, invaluable efforts, both on the early detection, citizen science monitoring, as well as their expertise in green crab science and research. So we need to keep supporting them. And so they're a critical part of our team. And so we need to, and they also work on the coast as far as coordination and such. So that doesn't come free. And there's also some money in here to do some specific research as well. RCO is the Recreation and Conservation Office. It's where the Washington Invasive Species Council is housed. It's also where many other councils are housed. And so what we're looking at here is part of the moving towards a policy forum group is utilizing an incident command system called multi-agency coordination group. And so funding would be supporting a facilitator to help pull that together. This would primarily be an initial policy forum to help us start pulling together what are the priorities, what are the needs, how do we move forward on this effort. Next one is RCO would do a rapid response interagency agreement fund. This is a critical piece. Again, many years have been, we proposed this to the legislature, and it would have gotten us so much further if we had a ready pot of money that was for invasive species rapid response. We could have gotten many more things done. But in this situation, we have to wait until the legislative session gets going, and then we have to ask for that money. And then by the time we get that money, a lot of times it's much later in the process than we would like. And that's why we're advocating for a rapid response fund. Again, about $500,000 per year. It would be for more agencies, but then the agencies can pass through that fund to local entities as necessary. And lastly, there is also an AIS local management grant. This is under statute already, but was never funded. Another $500,000 a year. This is a competitive grant It's all aquatic invasive species, but we can, focus on green crab. Again, these are about $0.5 million per year is additional funds that can be utilized by local entities to work in their areas. That's how we looked at how best to make this package suitable for the short term. As we move forward, again, through a policy forum, we need to identify what's the longer term needs. How do we keep supporting local entities such as yourselves to manage that your situation. So in the meantime, the department authorized $600,000 in spending for this the period we're in right now, January through March, with emphasis on supporting the Lummi Nation. That's our highest priority at this point, and about $300,000 to my unit for purchasing traps and boats. And as Ron was mentioning, our efforts to purchase traps is challenging. For example, we can only order 7 traps at a time from Walmart. And so if you want a bunch of traps from Walmart, you got to put in multiple requests and collect them. And boats are incredibly difficult, and boats with motors are very difficult to find right now, but they're critical for expanding our ability to trap both in deeper waters and more year round. Same thing going to the Lummi Nation to help them in procuring the traps and other things. You would think that there'd be hundreds of thousands of traps available. There are not. This is difficult, and we're trying to find the right ones. So we're also going to be using our existing funds and reprioritize our seasonal technical support in the Lummi Sea Pond initially. Once we get, and hopefully we'll get the money from the legislature, then we will then expand out our staff to include more for the coast. But in the short term, this is the highest priority that we have, and we are moving forward on that. We're hoping that the funding that does come in would be authorized to start spending in April 1st. Again, that's a request to the legislature. We don't know if they're going to honor that request or not. And then we also are setting up policy and technical communications in coordination with our travel co-managers, state and federal agencies. So most of that has been on a entity by entity basis at this point, and we're trying to develop a process to bring everybody together so we can move forward in a coordinated fashion. So I just, again, want to reiterate that we have a unique opportunity in Washington State. We are still at an early invasion stage. We're not in the same situation as Vancouver Island or down in California or possibly sites in Oregon at this point. And we are doing something that no other state has really tried to initiate. And we've been as responsive as I think we could possibly be in this situation. I know there was a question of, well, when we started seeing a population increase in 2015 in Willapa Bay, why didn't we jump at it at that time? Well, we recognized that that was happening, but it was also very similar to the other El Nino events where all of a sudden you get a little spike and then the next year it dropped. And actually it did drop in 2016. So understanding that the cycle in those outer coasts where the crabs weren't really necessarily establishing, we needed to keep a look on that. As we kept following it, especially in 2019, that's when we said, oh my gosh, there's a big thing going on here. And we did go to the governor's office and requesting emergency measures. That year, we did get another $783,000 from the legislature, and some of that money went to the coast, which helped us to understand in 2020 that this was not a fluke. This was something that was ongoing. We needed more money, so we went to the legislature and were able to get another $2.3 million, well, not another, but $2.3 million in 2021. So that money then helped us in the last year understand that it was another exponential growth. And so that's why we're going back to the legislature for $8.6 million. So this is something that we are moving on. We recognize that the coast has significant issues, that the populations there are large, and that you are continuing to detect them even now in the wintertime. All incredibly important information. But our number one priority right now is to get the funding through the legislature, and your support is critical. If you want this funding, please talk to your legislatures, talk to the Senate and House Budget Committee chairs, Senator Rolfes and Representative Fitzgibbons. And I'll end it at that point. Thanks, Chase.
Thank you very much, Alan. We've got a couple questions that we can cover now and then a few that we'll save for the panel at the end. Just segueing from that theme you were just talking about, there was a question from Bill about who is coordinating the effort to secure the funds from the legislature and what sort of reception has been received from the Senate Ways and Means and House Appropriations Chair. Anything you're able to share on that at this point?
Well, our department legislative liaison is the one that's moving this forward and working with our colleagues in the legislature on this. We have to date had very positive affirmations, but since the we're at a point now where there's no new bills being introduced, and so they're now going to be start looking at the funding pieces. This funding is not part of a specific bill. It's just a funding appropriation. So it's something that you need to talk with your legislators about if you're interested, or talk to the chairs of those funding committees in the Senate and the House.
Well said. Brian asked a question a bit earlier that I think you'd be the right person to touch on around who is working on this from the Washington State Department of Agriculture, noting that shellfish are an agricultural crop, and the Washington Invasive Species Council. And again, I know we have a few folks from both those groups on the webinar today, but Alan, anything you can share around coordination with those two entities?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I talk with Justin Bush, who's the executive coordinator of the Washington Invasive Species Council, regularly on this. I've talked with our other state colleagues on it. The proclamation identifies the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Ecology, and Parks and Recreation offices as important aquatic landowners that we will be coordinating with. We've had meetings with them, which included Washington Department of Agriculture. And so we are moving forward on trying to coordinate and figure out how to best move, what responsibilities can be done. But if we don't, there could be a lot of planning, but the planning really depends on whether or not we get the funding.
Right. We've had a couple questions about the consideration that Willapa Bay does or doesn't receive in comparison to the Salish Sea. And I think this question was from Ed. How come Willapa Bay doesn't receive the same consideration as others with lesser concentrations and lower CPUs in the form of direct pass-through money? And I know you spoke a bit about the Coastal Management Grant Program, which would be a significant resource for the coast. Is there any further detail you can share about that program and sources of funding that will be available for the coast?
Well, there's the three sources that I talked about. There's the Coastal Mitigation Grant, the Coastal Management Grant. There is the Interagency Rapid Response Fund, and then the AIS Local Management Grant. So there's three potential funds that the coast can have access to. And the coastal one is specific to the coast and it's specific to green crab. The other two are not specific to green crab. They are in a broader sense, for other invasive species, but can be focused on green crab. And so we're trying to be not just hyper-focused on green crab, because if you just hyper-focus on one, then another species can come in around the corner here. So we want to make sure that we're set up not just for green crab, but for everything that we need in this situation. As I said, as we move forward in 2021, trying to determine how best to form this budget request, there were clear identifications of where some of these hotspots were and others were not as clear as far as this line item needs to go to this entity, because what we felt was if we started putting money in one area, without a good discussion, without policy discussion about this is the area that we want to put it in, that would have caused actually more trouble within the coastal areas. So that's why we decided to do a grant program, and that local entities would then be in charge of determining who gets that money. We thought the best way to go, again, in this next year and a half. After that, wide open, what do we need to do? How is it better to have line items for specific entities or not? We're open to those discussions.
And just to clarify, those local entities could decide to allocate some of those funds to shellfish growers, for example. Is that one option under
Correct.
that? Yep.
Correct.
Thank you. I hope that answers some of those questions. We can dig into that a little more during the panel. And again, if you feel like we did not get to your question or did not answer it fully, please feel free to follow up with Alan, with Chelsea, with myself. We will get you connected and try to get you an answer. We'll put those emails in the chat, and many of you should have Chelsea's email already.
Right.
One more for you, Alan. Linda had asked, how does the Rapid Response Fund speed the process other than setting aside the monies prior to the legislative session? And I think she's getting at here is the interim funding that we have put in place prior to the legislative funding being finalized. And again, how does that happen? The Rapid Response Fund speed the process other than setting aside the monies prior to the legislative session is what was asked.
It would be, again, there's a group to be determined would act as the arbiters of where does that money get put. And it can be rapidly issued to a state agency, tribe, or other intergovernmental agency. And I believe that could include a county or somebody. I'm not 100% sure on that. But that money can just be rapidly divvied out as we understand those needs. So it doesn't have to go through a competitive process. Now the grant program for the coast, at this point, it's up to the coast to say whether it's a competitive process or whether they're going to do it more on like a rapid response, then make decisions and then send it out right then and there. That's a decision we want to give, to the coast to be able to make.
Great. We had a question from David, and I think this is an important general question, but how do you feel in terms of whether the funding that has been requested as part of the emergency measures request this session, is it sufficient? Is it enough to make a real dent at this problem in the current biennium? David had asked, will the funding be sufficient?
I think the funding is sufficient for this next year and a half. And because it's going to take a lot. It sounds like a lot of money, and then it doesn't sound like a lot of money if you talk about it. But if you try to spend that kind of money in all the different areas that we're talking about, that is a challenge. And I think we're going to be hard pressed to make sure that we getting what we need to get done. If we identify that more money is going to be required, that's where we go back to the legislature and request more. We're hoping that the funding is ongoing, and it's not just a proviso for this biennium, but we don't know again. And again, those are pieces that we need to understand. And if we can count on it, then we can do more long-term planning and being able to divide where those resources need to go.
Really quickly before we move on, how will the coast make those decisions? I think this is a question from Scott about clarifying, will there be a formation of a stakeholder board, or what is the coastal entity that will determine where the funding goes, if that funding is appropriated by the legislature?
At this point, we'll be asking the coast to develop and make a proposal what that entity will be. Who's going to be on it? How's it going to work? Is there one for Grace Harbor, one for Willapa Bay? Is it a combined for the entire coast? We're not trying to dictate what that's supposed to look like. We want your input on what you want it to look like.
Thank you. And one last one from Mike. Have you considered sending funding directly to the conservation districts for direct boots on the ground?
Well, again, that's where we started going, well, if we send it to the conservation districts, is that the right path? If you on the coast decide that the conservation districts are the right path, that's the way we're gonna route it. But we didn't make that decision for you.
Thank you, Alan. I think that covers it for now. There's a bunch of questions still in the chat that we're going to get to during the panel discussion at the end. And again, if you feel like we didn't get your question, please feel free to follow up via email. So I think that covers it. We'll move on to a quick presentation on outreach and engagement, and then we'll jump back into the full panel discussion. Thank you. All right, I'm going to share my screen now. And again, I want to stress that the priority for a green crab is emergency management, trapping, and really getting ahead of this problem. But we know that there is a ton of interest and enthusiasm from the public. We want to help support public identification and reporting for this invasive species. And that requires some work around communications and from our public affairs team and continued collaboration with our partners. So I'm going to share a quick presentation that has some of the ideas we've developed around green crab outreach, and then we'll move into the full panel discussion. All right, I stole this photo from Chelsea. I think it helps highlight the threat here in a way that the public can appreciate. First, a little bit about me. I'm the newest member of WDFW's invasive species team. I'm based in our public affairs unit, but assigned to support aquatic invasive species. I'm headquartered here in our North Puget Sound region and primarily covering the Puget Sound, but eager to support aquatic invasive species issues and a particular soft spot for the Washington coast. My family has deep roots in the fishing industry around Aberdeen and Grays Harbor, used to own some small working tidelands on Hood Canal, and eager to dive into these issues. I am new with WDFW, but have worked in natural resource communications and policy for a bit over a decade. So not new to this kind of work, but new to WDFW and green crabs. I've got my contact information there in the slide. Please feel free to shoot me an email or reach out if you have ideas around green crab outreach, communications, or other opportunities to connect with the public around this issue. We saw a big spike in media attention around green crabs late last year and into early 2022. This is just a couple examples of the coverage that was coming in both from local and state outlets, as well as some big national outlets that were paying close attention to this issue in light of the Lummi Nation's emergency declaration and Governor Inslee's emergency order. And that attention is welcome. It helps elevate this threat. We're hoping to see similar coverage and attention around the coordinated management strategies and trapping efforts that are going to be deployed this year if the resources from the legislature allow. And along those lines, we've developed some communications and outreach plans to support greater coordination, information sharing, public engagement, and especially public identification and reporting around European green crabs in Washington state. We get questions every day in email, on social media, in forums such as this one about how folks can get involved, how we can help them identify green crabs and distinguish them from native shore crabs and kelp crabs, which I'll get to in I think the next slide. We know that people are interested in this topic and they want to get involved, and we want to improve the resources and the information available to help them do so. So as Alan mentioned, as part of the emergency measures funding request to the state legislature this year, we included a community outreach and education position that will be working with me and dedicated specifically to green crabs. That's a person that can help develop updated publications and outreach resources, things like brochures with a QR code, which you can scan and then takes you right to a reporting form that's consistent between the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Washington Invasive Species Council, and also a person that can go out into the community and present at stakeholder meetings, at clubs, at festivals and conferences about European green crabs in Washington. While Chelsea and Ron are busy out leading teams in the mud to trap these crabs, this is a person who has a full capacity to present to the public about this issue and help educate them on what do green crabs look like, what impact do they have on our native ecosystems, and how the public can help identify and report them and get involved in this issue, including through some of the several community science projects that groups like Washington Sea Grant have underway. That is contingent upon the funding request that's currently before the legislature, but we've already begun a bit of this work, including starting to plan for updated outreach and communications resources, overhauling some of our web content. And hopefully, if that funding does come through, we'll begin hiring for that position later this spring. If you have community events, festivals, meetings, other opportunities where someone from WDFW could come and work with the public or with your group members about how to identify and report on European green crabs, to share some of this information about this invasive species, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm looking to get a calendar together for different opportunities this spring and summer to do so, and really welcome your suggestions, and personally appreciate any opportunity to get out to the Washington coast, so may tag along as well. Here's a bit more about some of the current information that we have available for European green crab reporting. Now, again, many of you on this call today are likely stakeholders who are very familiar with how to tell these crabs apart from a hairy shore crab or a kelp crab. But unfortunately, we have seen cases of misidentification, and there is a need to get this information out for the public. In particular, if we're going to pursue at some point in the future a regulatory change around the rules prohibiting the possession of this invasive species. It is, as you can see on the slide here, it is not inconceivable how someone might misidentify a green crab with, say, a purple shore crab. There is some similarity there for the public. And that brings me to the current regulatory environment around green crabs. I've got a screenshot of the revised Code of Washington down there. As Ron mentioned at the beginning, and as Alan and others have hit on, currently they are a prohibited level 1 species. And this puts some constraints around the ability to employ the public or others in trapping these crabs without special authorization. And again, there's some additional reasons why that may be limited. It's also something that we are keeping in mind, that there's a great interest in getting involved. And one of the first steps is supporting greater public education, reporting, outreach, all these things to help familiarize people with this species in the interest of getting more folks involved in combating this invasion. So this is something that's very much on our mind. It's something that's going to be in consideration as we're working on our outreach materials and outreach efforts this summer. And we do welcome your interest and feedback on that. And thanks to the many of you that have already reached out about lending a hand. This is where things stand today, however, and it's worth keeping in mind. And now I just want to open it up. If folks, again, if you have ideas as far as what you would like to see for public outreach, education, reporting, and identification information, if you have an event, a conference, a meeting, something coming up that the WDFW or our partners can table or present at about green crabs, or just suggestions around how we can better engage the public and stakeholders under the existing regulatory environment, please do reach out to me. I welcome that information, welcome those opportunities to connect with folks out in the field this summer. Really welcome and appreciate all of you logging on today. My contact information is available there. And if you are interested, I'll just take a look and see if anything went in the, nothing in the Q&A so far, but again, feel free to follow up with me if you have ideas around green crab outreach. And a special shout out to Ron for the photo in the bottom left there of trekking those shrimp traps deep into Willapa. I know that he and the team were really dedicated last summer, and this picture just shows that. So unless there's any questions that folks have for me in the chat, I'm gonna now move us along to the panel discussion. We have about 20 questions open in the Q&A, a lot that we wanna cover with our panel of experts. Again, thank you all for tuning in and participating today. And if you feel like we do not get to your question, please follow up with us afterwards. There's a lot of work to be done on this issue and a long ways to go. And we're hopeful that we'll have the resources we need to begin to really ramp up the scale of the response this year. If you are a member of the panel and you are not able to be promoted or added to the panel, but you're supposed to be, please feel free to reach out to us. I know that Diane Tilton, my colleague, is working on that right now. Looks like the panelists, you can go ahead and turn your video on. Again, if you have any problems, reach out to us, including in the Q&A. And I think that there was one panelist who is on the phone. And if you are that person, you will need to unmute yourself by dialing *6. There we go. Okay, I think looks like we've got everyone here. Thank you all. We've got a lot of questions to cover, but before we do, I want to turn the floor over to Ron to quickly introduce some of our panelists, especially those who did not previously give a presentation today. Ron, take it away.
Absolutely. So I'm going to include everybody, even people that you have already heard from in the presentations, just to be clear with all our panelists. So from DFW, we have Alan Pleus, myself, and Chelsea Buffington. From Washington Sea Grant, we have Emily Grason, who you've heard from, and Alex Stote. From the University of Washington, you've already heard from Sean McDonald. From the Shoalwater Bay Indian Tribe, you've heard from Larissa Ritzman and Richard Ashley as well. He'll be joining us. From Pacific County Vegetation Management, you have Seth Flametis and Ed Darcher. From Pacific Seafoods, we have Kyle Deerkop. Are you on the phone? And then we will have from Willapa Grace Harbor Oyster Growers Association, we have David Bagley. So those should be our panelists.
Thank you, Ron.
No problem.
I'm going to go ahead and just move into some of these questions here. I do have a prompt that I'd like to ask you all at the end as we wrap up, but a lot of great questions and we've got a limited amount of time. One of the first things that was in our Q&A that we haven't gotten to yet was that, and again, if anyone and everyone that feels like they have an answer to this question, please feel free to respond. We'll work through different responses from each of you that would like to engage. Rich had asked, how have other areas with permanent European green crab establishments adapted their aquaculture and harvest practices for the affected natural resources? And a lot of important implications for that question. Does someone want to take that one?
Can you hear me okay? I guess I could take it. Yeah, so a couple of ideas. There are multiple jurisdictions where folks have done that, where they have adapted aquaculture practices in light of green crab infestation. On the East Coast, although it's not as much aquaculture as it is wild clam fisheries, in many areas, folks in Maine and other Northeast states are using netting and other physical structures to sort of prevent green crab from getting to clams. It's much like some of the materials that West Coast growers already use. And that was something that they hadn't been doing previously. It was mostly just sort of the wild harvest. So as we see more aquaculture as well, they're doing more to actually protect their harvest from green crab. On the US West Coast, the best example we have is of Manila clam harvest in Tamales Bay. That's a Hog Island oyster farm back in the, I believe it was the early 2000s or maybe mid 2000s. They were having trouble with green crab actually larvae settling out into their clam bags. They were growing clams on bottom in bags with gravel. And the green crab would actually settle out into the bags and then grow up within the bags. They would actually size up to the point where they couldn't escape from the bags, which meant that they just had all the time in the world just to try it and chew up clams. And at the end of, with the time of harvest, growers would open up the bags and all they would end up with was just one big fat green crab and a whole bunch of clam shell. So that was fairly problematic. In terms of adaptation, I believe the thing that they started doing was one, changing the timing of their bag placements. That seemed to help a little bit. And I believe they also started putting out their seed at a slightly larger size, which seemed to help them as well. But I'd recommend for growers to get in touch with the Hog Island folks, since they've been dealing with green crab and their clam operations for a very long time.
Thank you, Sean. Would others like to address that? Before we move on to some of these other questions, I want to give the opportunity. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I got just a comment to make. I'm not sure if this is exactly germane to the question, but there are serious indications that the manila clams are being, their population is dropping rapidly, and early or recent trapping efforts have produced a large number of green crab.
Thank you for that. And I was going to just ask there if others who were not previously presenters wanted to, had comments or information that they wanted to share, wanted to give you the microphone. Anything else to add, Seth or David?
Oh, yeah, I'll add real fast, Chase, that at this point, I'm not aware of any farmers using any of those practices like Tomales Bay to raise clams and Willapa Bay or Grace Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
And I just
Alex?
wanted to clarify something that came up earlier in Sean's presentation, which is that we had Washington Sea Grant and the University of Washington had applied for an oyster reserves funding opportunity this past year, where we trapped for green crab on and off clam beds, and currently, and that was within Willapa Bay, and currently the graduate student that Sean mentioned is processing those gut contents to really try to understand this question of what are green crab eating. And so the results for that are still sort of TBD, but I know that there was sort of some back and forth in the chat of like, we're already doing this work, there might be some duplication, and I think that we're talking about the same study there. So just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Alan, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is another area where as we move forward in developing a statewide management plan or a coastal management plan, this is the kind of research that we need to move forward with. Right now, our main intent is how to capture and remove green crab. That's our primary intent. We are hoping that we can get to that point where you don't have to, we can trap down the numbers so that they are not creating the harm that you're on those areas. If we can't do that, then we do need to move forward on how to mitigate for these pests. And it could be done in a parallel fashion, but I just want to reemphasize that our primary intent, at least from DFW, has been more about how to capture and get rid of these crabs in an early invasion stage. So as we move forward, it's a great and a very important piece for us to look at, but we have limited resources. So where do we put those resources? Again, I want to hear from the people and the partners out on the coast. Where are those priorities? Where do you want those resources put? Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else to add on this question, or folks that didn't previously present that want to share comments? All right, not seeing any hands. There's a general question here from Tammy, who's with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game around. She's curious what sort of research is occurring in Washington on direct impacts, economic or environmental, such as impacts on commercial oyster production, changes in abundance diversity, or other invertebrates and macrophytes where EGC populations are expanding. And I think what she's getting at here is what research and evidence do we have and what's ongoing around impacts on our natural resources in areas where green crab are present. Sean or Emily or Alex or Chelsea, anyone want to take that question and provide a bit more detail?
I'm happy to start to take to start to answer that. And I think, you know, Alex did a really nice job just describing the scope of one of the pieces of that puzzle, which is directly addressing impacts on clam beds by doing both, you know, comparative gut content analysis and looking at seasonal trends, as well as tracking, you know, what other species are present at nearby clam beds versus nearby habitats that are not under active aquaculture, and starting to look at community differences through that lens. I think the other, you know, big piece of the puzzle, you know, with invasions generally ongoing, one of the big challenges is we rarely get to gather baseline information before the invasive starts to become abundant. And in order to really assess impacts, you can, you know, substitute space for time in some cases, but we rarely have the chance to do that. I think that in looking at sort of, you know, ecological changes that are happening to other species as well, and changes in native communities, that's one thing, you know, the Sentinel network will help address, as we have, you know, a range of green crab densities across those sites and some ability to, you know, compare them to sites inland. But I do agree that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to further quantify the impacts, and particularly to understand things like the relationship between the density of green crabs and the impacts observed. That's what the information that's needed to really drill down into this idea of, you know, management target densities or thresholds or anything like that. And that's where, you know, that's where I would see a valuable contribution to our knowledge going.
This is Kyle from Pacific Shellfish. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Kyle.
Yeah, I would just like to comment that in my experience on the beds, you know, we've done trapping ourselves this last year and caught a significant number, but the real interaction of concern for me is that the interaction in the nursery area for the Dungeness crab. We just had a record year for landing value in the fishery, in many millions of dollars. This is an issue that goes up and down the coast from California to Alaska. Just the ability of a 3 to 4 inch crab to be present and highly active in that area where the larval Dungeness are settling out. I mean, we can literally see when they're settling and the way that they come down and start to migrate deeper. That's the real concern for me. At this point, as David has said, we haven't seen as much direct impact that we know of with the oysters in particular out here on the coast. That being said, with the densities being low, when they become higher, they may flip to the oysters when there's a reduced food availability. But the real interaction of concern for me at this point is really the Dungeness and green crab interaction. I don't think it's been fully studied and understood.
Yeah, and this is David. I'll add that I do see a lot of value in additional research. I think at this point, though, we just don't have the time to dedicate funds and time to that. There's such a crisis going on right now. We've got other things to focus on with limited resources. And I think it's pretty clear what the priorities need to be.
Well, I you know, only just to chime in to say I completely agree that you know, that they're really, I'm not a manager, but certainly focusing on addressing these really high numbers needs to be a priority. I do think, you know, that ideally we try to strike some sort of balance so that we can continue to collect some data. And I say that because some of the data will help us in identifying whether or not we're being successful in our management. And so I completely agree with you, David, about that. To speak to your the previous comment about Dungeness crab, that is an issue as well. And some of the early work that we did was looking at the impact of green crab on early juvenile Dungeness, and that's definitely a very large concern, and one that may go unnoticed, at least initially, because it's so hard to track those interactions.
Kyle, or anyone else, any follow-up on that before we go on to the next question?
Yeah, I just want to mention that we are in discussions with the federal agencies. A lot of those agencies really specialize in science, and we want to advocate to them to do research. The USGS is very interested in doing research. We're working with others, really trying to engage the federal agencies in this effort. They haven't been nationally yet, and so this is the opportunity, and we're pushing hard both for financial support as well as science and perhaps boots in the mud as well. So we're working as many angles as we can. Thank you.
All right, well, this is a good segue for another question that came up in the chat from Linda about whether red rock crab are still considered robust competitors to green crab as a form of biotic resistance. And I think this came up a little bit on Tuesday as well, but any information that we can share about competition between red rock and green crab and whether there are benefits there or risks?
I think
This is Kyle again. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is Kyle from Pacific Shellfish again. In our experience when trapping, we would trap different areas than the fentanyl sites. They're predominantly high intertidal and walkout sites. And what we were doing was trapping next to our oyster operations. What we would find is that as soon as we would get into the sloughs, like right off of our oyster beds, that the crab that we would catch in our shrimp traps were all red rock and Dungeness. It kind of depended on the part of the bay, which one was more prevalent, but there was a definite competition there once you kind of got off the oyster bed and down into the slough.
Thank you, Kyle. And I want to note that Bill Dewey from Taylor Shellfish put more or less the same observation into the Q&A and talked a little bit about that last week up in Samish Bay, that as they attempted to trap deeper, they were getting much more juvenile Dungeness in their trapping targeted at green crab, which was a reason for them to focus more on the upper intertidal areas as opposed to the lower intertidal areas. Emily, it sounded like you had some thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate Kyle chiming in, because I'm most interested to hear what people are seeing on the ground, and a number of observations so far have sort of echoed that it's rare to find both green crabs and the larger cancrids in the traps at the same time. What's interesting, and this is supported in some work done a couple decades ago in looking at direct competitive interactions, particularly with rock crabs, as being even when rock crabs are the same size as green crabs, rock crabs are pretty good at competing with them and preying on green crabs. Now, what's one piece that is different in other locations is that up in Canada, in some of the coastal inlets, they are more commonly now finding these crabs to use similar habitat. There's more habitat overlap. And the question that I would have is whether this is a function of the higher densities, that the populations of green crabs are so large that they can sort of sustain a little bit of loss from the cancrids. And so they're seeing more habitat overlap of the really large crabs. For now, what I'm hearing, and it sounds like other people are seeing, that we still have a little bit of protection from the large cancrids where they are larger than green crabs, at least in terms of the life cycle interactions.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that before we go on to the next question? Another, I think a question that might be a good segue from that is Arthur had asked early on today, have there been any studies on larval stage control? And we've heard this come up before around, are there strategies available to control green crab during the larval stage? Any information that this group can provide on that question?
I can speak to that only in that in all of my reviews of previous work that's been done in workshops looking at various control methods for green crab. Control at the larval stage has not been prioritized. I think in part because it would be very difficult to do. I think once the larvae are released, they're so diffuse in the water and spread out so broadly that it would be pretty challenging in most situations to institute any sort of control at that point.
Thank you, Sean. And Linda, I see that you had a question earlier in the chat as well about efforts to control larval spread from Oregon into Washington. And I hope that addresses the question as well. It would be a real challenge. Again, encourage folks to put questions. Go ahead, Alan.
So one of the things that Sean had mentioned, a sea drift lagoon, and there was a question there about it was considered a failed thing because they found that the adults were preying on the juveniles, and that, you know, the larval retention was all of a sudden the next year they had an explosion there. So this is something that we're looking at with the sea ponds. So there's some situations where larvae can be concentrated and where we might be able to deal with larvae at that life stage. It's a critical piece of research that we want to be looking into. And I think it's going to be critical for places like Sea Drift Lagoon or other kinds of impoundment areas where larvae could be concentrated. When you talk about open basins, yeah, that gets into, you know, the difficulty of trying to control that when you have all sorts of other organisms in the water column. But when you have a much more contained situation, those are places where we really do want to focus on what can we do with larvae. And so it is an important area to consider, and we want to move forward on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, for bringing that up. I mean, I think that is certainly in a situation where you have a very confined area where concentrations of larvae could be quite high and not as diffuse as you might see in open ocean scenarios. That could be an area to explore, and I'm very interested in thinking about that.
Anything else that we can share? And just getting back to Linda's question a little bit, is there, making sure that we interpreted that question correctly, is there anything else we can share in regards to controlling populations of green crab adults in places where they don't currently have management plans in place? We know that you know, our authority may be limited. Washington is looking to get ahead of this emergency, but that the source populations are going to remain. And is there any ability to influence management plans in places where they're not currently in place? Alan, I figured you might want to take that one.
Well, when we started this new phase of green crab management, it was really driven by 2012 detection of green crab in Sook Basin up on the south end of Vancouver Island, where they detected a very large population. You know, our concern was all of a sudden this could be a source within the Salish Sea. It's a seed source that's going to start spreading. So that's when we started working with Sea Grant to create the early detection network. We also started working with our colleagues up in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And because at that point they were doing mostly research. You know, they would go out there and say, yeah, we're catching these things, but we're not really reducing the populations. It's just more of a science effort, monitoring what's going on, what are they doing. So since that time, though, we have worked really well with our Canadian colleagues. They have started working in creating a similar type of citizen science network of early detection in the Salish Sea. They're also working very strongly with the First Nations in BC. And as we reported, CRS, Coastal Restoration Society, is starting to do active removal trapping. This is really critical and important information. And I think it's directly related to our state moving forward and saying, we can do this. And the Canadian government going, yeah, we can do this too. Let's work together. Now, as we have these successes, I think it's going to start moving our colleagues down in Oregon and California, similar to what happened with Spartina. When we started with the Spartina up here, the seed sources were coming from the south. And so as we move forward, they started seeing that, yeah, we can deal with Spartina, so let's start managing it in our own areas. I think that's going to happen with green crab, and that's what I'm looking forward to. So there's synergy that we're trying to move forward here, but we're at the leading edge of this as far as the states, and we're very happy to have our colleagues up in Canada supporting this, and we're going to be working towards bringing in other entities. So this is a West Coast effort, not just here. So I agree with that. It's critical. And I know Alaska is very concerned about the sources because they're the next ones on the invasion curve. And so we need to all work together. And as Ron started out, you're going to hear the word collaboration a lot from now forward. So that's what it's going to take. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to, hand up there?
Yeah, this is Ed Darcher again. And I hate to beat a dead horse in a way, but we're handcuffed by funding. We've been doing this out of pocket and for over a year, and we're continuing doing it during the winter and with no foreseeable, opportunities really that are, clear-cut ways that we can continue putting boots on the ground and using our equipment. And if collaboration also extends to funding too.
Well said. Anything else folks want to add on that or about coordinated management across state lines and various jurisdictions? All right, I'm not seeing any hands up. Sure, we may get back to that topic. It's an important one. David, you had asked earlier in the chat, I think a question directed at Sean, but just want to make sure we covered it before we leave the topic of green crab larva. You'd asked about whether there's any opportunity to introduce a YY chromosome or a strategy around Trojan or Judas breeding. I know that's something that's been tried with other species. Did I get your question right? And if so, Sean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and we've seen some, genetic manipulation in the past of other species to try and make them infertile. We see the idea of like the Judas goat, that's a very common one on islands where they'll release a goat that has a radio collar on it, and it will lead the hunters to other goats. Sort of sad in a way, but these ideas are really interesting. As far as I know, there's been no effort to genetically manipulate the crabs to make them sterile. That's not anything that anyone's tried as of yet. Although one could imagine a situation because of the mating behavior of green crab. Large dominant males they have more mating opportunities than smaller males, and they occupy the females for longer periods of time. So you can at least conceive of a way in which some sterile male could limit mating opportunities by other individuals. It's similar to the way that mosquito control is being done in some places too. So it's a really interesting idea, but to this date, I know of nobody working on that for green crab. Emily, do you have any ideas? Have you heard anything about that? Okay.
I want to get to a question that Bill had asked around standardization of data to collect and methods to do that efficiently. And he said, we have developed an e-Series survey 123 app for our phones that we use in Samish that has worked pretty well, but perhaps there is a better tool that we could all be equipped with in terms of standardizing data collection. I know that there's a number of efforts underway to compile data around green crab monitoring and trapping, but Alan or Emily or Alex or Sean, anyone, Larissa, Chelsea, is there anything you can add around prospects for standardizing data collection around green crabs?
I'll just chime in quickly in what the department is pushing forward right now. Currently, we are working with our IT folk to make an iForm data collection app for us in the field to work with as soon as possible. And that is getting us ready to go in the field by April. And so we're hoping to have that for us to utilize then. The long-term goal is to work with IT. Part of the funding request is to have an IT person that can help us develop these things and get us going and have that better collaboration and compiling data from all different entities and working towards an app that might be, I don't want to go too far in a dream, but the goal in the end would be to have some sort of application that if you have an email address, you can access it and you can follow the data entry all across the board. And there's a way for us all to share that data in real time. And that is something that I have been advocating for and pushing forward with. And if this funding goes through, I think that that dream will become more of a reality. And there will be future conversations between all collaborative partners to maybe find some way that we could share this data in a way that works for all different entities involved.
Thank you. Alex, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, and thanks for the peek into that, Chelsea. I'm sure that's something we're all really excited about eventually sort of getting to use and test out and come to light. I just wanted to add some additional context to, I think, why this question is really important and why it's something we're all thinking about right now. And that's that in just the last year alone, trapping, particularly on the coast, has evolved through sort of different stages and has moved to involve different sort of methods that we employ for different reasons. And so Emily's talked about the Sentinel sites, for example. That is a very specific type of monitoring that follows a very specific type of protocol that has a very specific type of data collection. But there's various other types of trapping that are happening right now, which Larissa introduced us to and sort of and showed us her shop of all of the different types of tools she uses. And so we're sort of encountering this time where having various groups sort of in the mud and doing either removal trapping, or we've heard assessment trapping versus the Sentinel trapping. All of these methods get it really trying to collect different information. And so that's sort of been where we have been lagging in some respects of all getting on the same page of what information we all need out of each of these trapping efforts. And so I think my sort of note of caution going into the new field season is making sure that there is more of an sort of agreed upon standardized method of what is the minimum information we need from things like removal efforts versus things like assessment efforts, and making sure that we're all clear on why we actually need that information. Because as Larissa pointed out, it takes time to collect and we don't need all information in every single circumstance. It's really sort of tweaked to the type of trapping and the goals that we're really after. So I think it's a great question and really sort of an evolving question as we sort of continue to work through these different trap types on the coast.
Yeah, this is Larissa, and I just want to add too, especially when we were out last week when Ron came down with all the different trap types, we even just had a discussion of these removal efforts are going to need, since they're getting such a large amount of crab, the data that we're getting can be a smaller subset. And then possibly trying to do something like quarterly or every other month to do a more habitat type assessment trap that's not the Sentinel site too. So you can kind of document if your biodiversity is changing or how we can kind of put something down to get an ecological changes or something like that too in these environments to see if what we're doing is actually having an impact. So maybe developing something like that in the future too, because yeah, right now with removal, I mean, when you're getting 1,000 crabs every 2 weeks possibly. I mean, it's hard to quantify that data. I mean, timeline wise, especially for us, because I've told my staff you can really only spend 8 hours a week doing this because we don't have the funding to do it much larger than that. So it is difficult to just make sure we're getting the data that is useful to all partners, but also at the same time, not so we're spending 25 hours a week after that looking through this data and extrapolating what we need from it and GPSing every single trap point. We do see where that's an issue sometimes because we can't find traps, but we just forgot one. So we figured it out eventually. And I think even last week, someone said they found one of a pot that we may have lost like a year ago, and they found it when they were looking down in Nakata. So there is a lot of concerns about the data, because I do think, I'm even concerned with Lummi, because I know Lummi is leaving their shrimp pots out for 5 days at a time and checking them 1 day a week. I don't know how that's going to quantify with our data when we do it a different avenue. If you're talking soak times and your CPUE, I mean, how are we going to quantify those and make everything equal out? Because I don't know how they're looking at that and then comparing it to the data where traps aren't being set for that long time, because we do ours 24 hours and check them like that, rebait them and set them again. There's other participants who are not doing that. So there needs to be a uniform way to do it, or if there isn't a uniform way, then how are we going to combine all that data to make it so it's all having the same answer, I guess, sort of.
Yeah, it's important. David, go ahead.
Yeah, just for the removal trapping, I'm really in support of keeping it as simple and as streamlined and efficient as possible. Just thinking about the people that will be involved.
Yeah, David, I totally agree. I think when you start in this, I'm supporting Larissa as well, as I mean, when you get into these numbers that you're talking about, you really do want to try to streamline the data collection process and just collect the bare minimum. And I think that's one of the reasons why having, in addition to removal trapping, having things like the Sentinel sites is so important. The idea behind the Sentinel sites was to try and limit the, across an entire network, limit the total amount of effort that any one group is putting in by making it a once a month data collection opportunity. And then we get some standardized information from that that allows us to draw broader conclusions. So doing some more limited data collection, either through Sentinel sites or some other sort of effort, and then as part of regular removal, then just collecting the bare minimum so that you can get through it as quickly as possible and make a dent in the numbers.
Any follow-up thoughts on this question before we move on?
I just want to add that, we said this at the meeting on Tuesday as well, that the cash per unit effort and all of this kind of effort across the board is a larger conversation. And we will be revisiting those independent trapping partner conversations about CPUE trap types and how we can move forward with the different assessments and those minimum requirements. And I think that it's not going to be just one group deciding. I think that it does need to be, again, a collaborative decision, and we draft something up together and put it out together. And I think that that's our next step with that.
Thank you. We had a couple questions early on about chemical tools, and Brian, you had asked me to read your question in full, and so I'm going to do so. And I'd be curious to hear perspectives from the panelists about the feasibility of chemical tools to support the eradication of green crab. So here is Brian's question. Sean referred to an Australian pest manual as justification around not pursuing a pesticide tool. The manual refers to treating water bodies, but the 60 years program in Willapa for burrowing shrimp control occurred at low tide when water isn't present. That hardly seems a comparison, and non-target impacts are an issue with all pest management programs. What objective information is being used to justify the bias against pursuing a chemical tool as part of the eradication program? Welcome your thoughts on that and the feasibility of chemical tools in this scenario. And I understand. Go ahead.
Sean, are you pondering or?
Oh, no, was that direct? I wasn't sure if
Oh.
you wanted me to respond specifically or if it was for the group. I apologize. I
No.
was waiting.
No need to
yeah.
apologize. I was asking the group generally, and again, I was just going to say that, you know, there is multiple layers of jurisdiction around chemical tools. There's been some very heated fights around that topic, as we all know. Welcome thoughts from the group, but yeah, Sean, why don't you start us off?
Well, all I can say is, as I said at the outset of my talk, I'm not a manager, and I won't pretend to be. It's way above my pay grade. I'm a scientist, and so from my perspective, when I'm evaluating any of the particular tactics that we might use to reduce green crab numbers or eliminate them entirely, I have to think about the ecology, the biology of the species in question. And you know, just to Brian's point, burrowing shrimp are very different from green crab, just as green crab are very different from Spartina. And we have to take into consideration the biology and ecology of those organisms. You know, will pesticides kill green crab? Yes, the Australians have shown us that there are lots of ways that you can use chemicals to kill green crab. But my point wasn't that we should or shouldn't use them. My point was to highlight that there are considerations and limitations of that tactic, and that includes non-target impacts, and it includes you know, issues with getting the right chemical concentration, drying times, and things like that. In the case of green crab, unlike burrowing shrimp, which, you know, as Brian pointed out, you can dewater an area, apply the pesticide while the water is gone, and that's great to do at low tide. But green crab typically don't wait around at low tide. They're traveling with the tides in many cases, or they're burrowing deeply in areas where it might be difficult to actually get the pesticide to them. So if that is something that managers decide that they want to pursue, there's certainly need for some in-depth look at how you might be able to do that effectively for green crab in our area.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So it's not that aquatic invasive species, we don't think about pesticides. And when we talk about zebra and quagga mussels, it's been a long development to try to find a chemical that we would think we could apply to deal with a zebra quagga mussel infestation in Washington State in a freshwater system. And so in those situations, there's questions about open water, there's versus, you know, contained areas. So if you have a contained area, the application of a chemical is more feasible, but it still has a lot of hurdles. When you talk about open water systems, then you get into a lot bigger areas. And we're still working on that for zebra quagga mussels, but there's a lot more activity, especially if the ability to contain an area with like sediment filter, sediment barriers and things like that. So the point is that I don't automatically say chemicals are not on the table. They can be on the table. We're not the right group here to discuss whether it can be or not. We have to bring in other agencies, ecology, Department of Agriculture, other ones that are more understanding about putting pesticides, chemicals on the types of areas that you're talking about. And, you know, whether or not it can be contained, whether it's broadcast, all those other questions. It has not been part of the conversation. Part of it is because the evidence that Sean identified really didn't indicate any silver bullets there. So again, when we were talking about and thinking about how to get rid of green crab at this stage of the invasion, we're using the tools we can, but that's what we're trying to move forward with, is developing a more robust system where we can start bringing in these concepts, other concepts. What else can we bring onto the table? What research needs to be done? How to best apply it, etc. We can't answer that today, but that's something I think we can look at as we move forward.
Thank you both. Any additional follow-up thoughts on that question? All right, I'm not seeing any hands up. We've got about 15 minutes left. Before I go on to the next question, just want to again offer the microphone to anyone that hasn't gotten a chance to speak or did not present earlier. Anything on your mind that you'd like to share? All right, I'm not seeing a volunteer. And this may be, sorry to keep calling on you, Sean and Emily, but this may have been another question related to your presentation. And I do think it has implications for management here on the West Coast. Linda had asked, what degree of difference in cold tolerance is there between the East Coast, Southern, and Northern variants? And is there difference significant in predicting northward spread of European green crabs on the West Coast?
I can start to answer this, and I have to acknowledge that I'm still learning about this, and I've some of my collaborators are really good resources, including Carolyn Teepolt, who we collaborate with at Woods Hole, and who's on the call today. So there are a couple of papers that consider whether so I guess I should take a step back and say that on the West Coast, all of the crabs that we've ever looked at the genetics for clearly indicate that they are from the southern haplotype, or the southern sort of genetic lineage as of the native range. So as Sean mentioned, we want to avoid introducing additional potential genetic resources that could exacerbate the invasion, such as potentially cold tolerance. So a couple of the attempts to model the northward range extent of green crab as they currently stand have estimated that that adding that northern lineage would really expand how far green crabs could go. In particular, there's a study by some Compton et al. That looks at listing sort of, I think, Cordova as potentially one of the possibilities for the northern range extent of the southern haplotype. There's another model that puts the northern range extent at Prince Rupert and Haida Gwaii, which interestingly enough is exactly where green crab have most recently been identified to have their northern range extent. By contrast, some of the models that look at trying to anticipate where green crab could go and survive if the northern haplotype were present, it certainly extends all the way through the Aleutian. So it's a much greater range, and that just kind of provides a little bit more evidence of why prevention of genetic resources from other parts of the world continues to be an important part of the management strategy on the West Coast as a whole.
Anything else to add?
No, I really don't. Emily points out some great papers on that topic. And in fact, actually, I saw that question from Linda and sent her a link to the Compton paper already, which is an open access paper. It's really quite interesting to think about.
Great.
Scary because they certainly could spread much farther north than they already have.
Mm-hmm. I want to note, Rich had asked a couple questions about Sook Basin and dynamics for European green crab larvae in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Rich, Diana is going to send you the link to Tuesday's Salish Sea discussion, and we did cover both those topics in depth during that talk. Emily or Sean or Chelsea, anyone else, if you want to just really quickly touch on how the Strait of Juan de Fuca currents may be impacting larval spread in the Salish Sea, we could take just a minute to do so, but then want to get back to some questions about the coast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the quick bullet point summary is that it is very hard for green crab to cross the strait north to south. They typically get swept one way or the other. So we actually thought green crab at Dungeness Spit might originally be coming from Sook, and so far we haven't found evidence for that we have a lot more crabs to test. The second point that I'd make is that the population at Sook is a genetic subset of the wider coastal genetic pool. So if you take a subset of the genes, the genetic variability from the entire coast, and bottleneck it down, you sort of get what you see at Sook, as opposed to sort of hybridizing or any additional new genetic resources. It's just that bottleneck is enough for us to be able to tell an individual crab from Sook from an individual crab from the coast. Hopefully that clears up a little bit of the question.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for more more work coming out from that. That'll be in the literature at some point soon.
Thank you.
Yes.
And again, oh, go ahead. Didn't mean to cut
Oh, I
you
was
off.
just going to say, yes, our collaborator, Carolyn Teppold, is on the call. And one of the things that she brought up, there was an earlier question about, I think it was actually David's question about the genetic modification of green crabs. And she pointed out in the chat and in the Q&A, and I wanted to make sure people were aware that part of what she sees as a problem there is that we just don't know enough about the green crab genome. It hasn't been mapped well enough for us to actually have success with sort of what we call gene drive technology, right? The ability to actually manipulate the genes in a way that would actually be successful.
Thank you. Well, we've got just 10 minutes left. I want to open the floor really quick to see if there's any additional thoughts. And then I have a sort of concluding question that I want to go around and ask the panel. But before I do, any additional thoughts that we haven't covered, anything that's on your mind that you'd like to share? All right, well, I'm not seeing anything. Again, go ahead. Go ahead.
I got one question. What exactly would define a hotspot?
Thank you. We had not gotten to that one. It's a good one to double down on.
I'll just take a quick stab at this, Seth, and say, I think similarly to how we haven't collectively as a group defined what a site is, that's another word we sort of throw around when we're talking about trapping. At least to my knowledge, there is no threshold of abundance that would define a hotspot. And so when we're talking just sort of informally about hotspots, in my mind, those refer to places where we have detected sort of the highest relative abundances in a water body. And typically the hotspots that I think of in the coastal estuaries are all around the same level of abundance. And they're really separated out by other places where green crabs are present, but not nearly at the same magnitude as in other locations. So not a scientific explanation for you, just sort of a more informal, I guess, description.
Thanks, Alex. And I was just going to add to that, or I thought I was, my brain just totally blanked on me, but it's kind of, I think that because we don't have a threshold currently, and again, you know, furthering those conversations about CPUE and when we try to decide, you know, when are we going to put more effort here versus here based off the CPUE, and that's why those CPUEs are important to track over time. And so, you know, green crab are also very patchy and relatively, so there's been examples of us going out into a marshland and trapping several different channels, and maybe only one of those channels will turn up green crab consistently. So in like anecdotally, that is your hotspot. That's where you're going to target removal. But it can change over time. So that's why we still do assessments out from those hotspots so that we're tracking the movements.
Thank you. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, it's all relative. So a hotspot could be in early detection. All of a sudden, we catch a green crab in a place we didn't before. That triggers a rapid response because we don't know whether there's a lot there or not. So at that point, it becomes a hotspot. We do a lot of trapping. We find that they're very scattered. It sort of downgrades at that point. If that population persists, like it did at Dungeness Spit for a while, that becomes a hotspot because there's consistently capturing a number of crabs, relatively more than you can find in other places. And again, we're going from like handfuls to tens to hundreds. And in the case of, you know, Lummi Sea Pond, tens of thousands. And we're finding the same things. But, you know, when we talk about a hotspot right now for Grays Harbor or Willapa Bay, I'm saying Grays Harbor is a hotspot. Willapa Bay is a hotspot, but you know that within each of those geographic areas, there are hotter spots than others. It's more of a management term, like that's an area of emphasis at this point. But as we do more research and do more looking and figure out how to manipulate it, it then can be, you know, identified more finer in those situations. So it's a relative term. and it's more of a management application at this point of like, where are we putting our efforts at this time? And it just helps guide us in that way. So again, on the coast, 3 big hot spots, Macaw Bay, Willapa Bay, Grace Harbor Bay. And so at that point, we need to do, digging down as we move forward. Does that help? All right, thanks.
All right, thank you for that, Seth. Brian, I did see you had one more question in the chat about using tainted bait traps, and we did just have a discussion about chemical measures and some of the feasibility there. If there's anyone that wants to jump on that one, we can address whether there have been discussion about using tainted bait traps, but I know we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to put it to the group, and if that's something we prefer to have offline, we can do so.
I'll follow up with that. I think, again, it's a similar situation to we talked about any kind of chemical application where you have a defined, very finite area, such as Lummi Sea Pond. The possibility of using a poison bait traps may be more feasible. Again, depending on what else is in that area. Are you protecting something? Are there other endangered species, threatened species? What other types of animals could get in there? And access those. Those are all parts and parcels of those communications. It's not that it's off the table. You just have to be very thoughtful and surgical in when and how you use that to make sure that you're not impacting alternative species. So can it work? Sure. I mean, if you have baited traps that are poisonous, it's going to kill pretty much anything that's coming in there and wants to eat it. It's going to kill it. What else do you want to avoid killing? That's a very localized question and needs to be addressed on a very specific basis. At this point, there's limited applications to those areas that are fairly contained.
All right, well, with just a few minutes left, I want to open up the floor. We talked a little bit on Tuesday about things that give us optimism for this, the management and response to this emergency. We know that this is a serious issue on the Washington coast as well as other locations. Many different partners are attacking this issue. We're working on securing additional resources to ramp up the response, including to support local coordination and funding. But as we close, anything that's on your mind that gives you optimism in the fight against European green crabs in Washington? Someone's got to have some optimism. David, I saw you put your hand up. Ed, I think you too.
That's my optimism hand. Yeah, I just wanted to leave the closing thoughts here that I went through and I've read a lot of the research on these efforts in other locations and other case studies. And it is very disheartening to see the results that they've had there. But I want to, kind of rally the troops here and everybody that's on the call today and saying that this is something we have to do and something we have to try. And well, look and see how it works, and we'll reevaluate. And if we see success, we'll keep going. And if not, we'll look at other strategies. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm impressed by the energy and effort and education of the younger people that are involved in this, and it's a good sign for hope for the future there.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I'm glad I have a lot of younger people around me too. With their, I tell you, Chelsea and Ron and Emily and these others are just amazing to work with, and that really does give me a huge amount of positive energy to move forward on this. I also want to, when I started this and we started looking at green crab, not everybody was on board and saying green crab need to be managed. Well, they're never going to take hold in Washington. They haven't taken hold in Washington, and but now today, everybody I talk to, they're like, we got to get on this. We got to deal with it, all the way from the local level to the federal level. They understand that this is a big, significant issue. I'm very heartened. I'm heartened with our legislature. I think, again, this is the time. If this is important to you, contact your state legislators and let them know, because you can't just assume that they're going to say, oh, we understand. They've got a lot of stuff on their plate right now, and it could easily slip their mind. Well, I'm not hearing from anybody. Well, they need to hear, and that's the important part. And when we get that money, then we're going to hit this ground and we're going to start doing a lot of really important work and looking really forward to the collaboration on the coast. You guys have got a huge heart. You got a lot of energy. You got a lot of thoughts and knowledge about what can and can't work out there. That's what's going to make this a success. And I really appreciate your participation. Thanks.
All right, well, 1 minute left. Any other optimism to go around or any other concluding thoughts? All right, well, I've got some optimism. We had, I think, 82 people on today, over 100 on Tuesday. That's a lot of interest from the community in moving forward on this issue. Thank you all for tuning in. I know it's a long Zoom session. Again, we'll have these recordings up on the Department of Fish and Wildlife YouTube. This one will be posted sometime tomorrow. If you need to refer back to any of the presentations, you have Chelsea's contact information. You're welcome to reach out to me or Ron or Alan as well. If you have follow-up or you'd like to arrange a follow-up briefing, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you all. Unless there's any other final thoughts, we'll log off. All right. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.